The banker's fat fingers came down on the deed like he was swatting a fly. "Sign it," Chester Pratt said, leaning across his desk until Nora could smell the tobacco rot on his breath. "Or I send the sheriff out to your place by sundown. Your daddy can die in the dirt for all I care. The land's worth more than he ever was." Nora's hand shook over the paper. 23 years old, $46 to her name, a sick father who couldn't lift his head off the pillow, and a 16-year-old brother who still believed things were going to be fine. She had walked into this bank believing she could negotiate. She had been wrong. She picked up the pen. That was the moment the door opened. If this kind of story moves you ordinary people, cornered into impossible choices, fighting back with nothing but nerve and whatever scraps of dignity they have left, then you are exactly who this channel is for. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what comes next. Give this video a like if you want more stories like this one. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that bank in Dry Creek, Texas, and find out who just walked through that door. The man who stepped into First Cattle Bank of Dry Creek did not announce himself. He didn't have to. He was somewhere north of 30, built like someone who had spent every one of those years doing actual work rather than talking about it. Wide through the shoulders, narrow through the jaw, with a face that had been weathered past the point where you could call it handsome, and arrived somewhere more interesting than that. He wore a plain canvas coat, dusty boots, and a hat that had seen 3 or 4 hard seasons. He carried nothing except a leather satchel, and he moved through the door the way a man moves when he expects the room to rearrange itself around him and is mildly irritated when it doesn't. Chester Pratt looked up from his desk. His expression shifted, not quite fear, but the specific discomfort of a man who has spent years cultivating power in a small space and has just felt a draft from somewhere larger. "Mr. Rourke," Chester said. The man Rourke didn't look at Chester right away. He looked at Nora, not the way men usually looked at her, measuring or dismissing. He looked at her the way you look at something you've been thinking about and have finally decided to address. "Put down the pen," he said. His voice was flat, not unkind. Just the way a person says something when they've already decided it's true. Nora's hand stopped. She didn't know why. She didn't know this man. She had never seen him before in her life, and she had no reason in the world to listen to him. But something in the steadiness of his voice made her fingers go still, and she set the pen down without quite meaning to. Chester stood up. "Now just a minute. Sit down, Chester." Chester sat down. Rourke walked to the desk, set his satchel on the edge of it, and looked at the deed lying between Nora's hands. He read it for about 4 seconds. Then he looked at Chester. "How much does she owe?" Chester's jaw worked. This is a private matter between." "How much?" Chester told him. It was not a small number. It represented 3 years of bad harvests, her father's first medical bills, the seed loans that never paid off, the interest stacked on top of interest, the way bad luck stacks on itself when you can't afford to stop it. Nora had added it up so many times in the last 6 months that she could recite it in her sleep. She dreamed about it sometimes, the number floating above her in the dark, patient, and enormous. Rourke opened the satchel. He counted out cash on Chester Pratt's desk with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this before and found it tedious. He didn't count it twice. He didn't look at Nora while he did it. When he was finished, he closed the satchel and looked at Chester. "That covers the debt. The deed stays with her." Chester looked at the money. Then he looked at Rourke. Whatever calculation he was running behind his eyes, he didn't like the answer, but he liked it better than the alternative. "There's also the matter of the medical. I know about the medical." Rourke reached back into the satchel. He put more money on the desk. "That's for Dr. Haverford's account. You'll send word to him today that the Whitlock balance is cleared, or I'll have my lawyer in here by morning asking why you've been charging interest above the legal limit on a sick man's bills." Chester's face went the color of old chalk. Nora stood up. Her chair scraped the floor. "Who are you?" Rourke looked at her again. Unhurried. "Gideon Rourke. I run a cattle operation up in the mountains." "I know who runs cattle in this county," Nora said, "and I've never heard your name." "That's intentional." He picked up his satchel. "Walk with me. I want to ask you something. I don't know you." "No." But your debt is paid and your father's medical bills are settled, and I imagine that matters more to you right now than whether we're acquainted." He paused. "I'm not going to hurt you. I need to ask you a question, and I'd rather do it outside." Nora looked at Chester Pratt, who was staring at his desk with the expression of a man counting his losses. She looked at the deed, which was still lying unsigned in front of her. She looked at the money, which was real. She could see that much. Picked up the deed, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket. Then she followed Gideon Rourke outside. The main street of Dry Creek was quiet in the mid-morning heat. A wagon moved at the far end. Two women stood outside the dry goods store talking without enthusiasm. A dog slept in the shade of the post office steps and did not bother to lift its head as they walked past. Rourke stopped at the edge of the boardwalk, where the shade ran out. He looked out at the street for a moment, not at her. "I need a wife," he said. Nora stared at him. "Not the way you're thinking," he said, still not looking at her. "I need a legal spouse, married and recorded. It matters for reasons I'd rather not explain on a public street, but they're real reasons and they're serious." Now he did look at her. "I'm told you're steady, that you run the family accounts and have for years, that you don't frighten easily. Who told you that?" "People talk. I listen." He paused. "I'm told you've been fighting to keep your family's farm for 3 years by yourself, and that you've been fighting smart even when the numbers were against you." Nora's jaw tightened. "My father's been sick. I know. I'm not criticizing him." He tilted his head slightly, like he was adjusting for something. "The proposal is simple. You marry me today. There's a justice of the peace here in town who can do it this afternoon. In exchange, everything I paid today is a gift, not a loan. Your family's farm stays in your name. Your father gets ongoing medical care as long as he needs it. Your brother stays in school. You never owe me $1. And what do you get? A legal wife on record. That's not an answer." Something moved in his expression. Not quite respect. Something short of it, but in that direction. "It protects my land from a legal challenge. A man without an heir and without a spouse is vulnerable in ways I'm not willing to be vulnerable." Nora looked at him. His face gave very little away, but there was a tension in his jaw that had nothing to do with the conversation. Like he'd been carrying something heavy for a long time, and had learned to hold it without showing the strain. "What kind of land?" she asked. "Cattle ranch." "How much?" A brief pause, enough to be worth protecting. Nora crossed her arms. "If I marry you today, I go from one impossible situation into one I know nothing about. I'd be a fool." "Yes. So give me a reason not to be a fool." Rourke was quiet for a moment. "I'll put everything in writing before we go to the justice. Your father's farm and house deed secured in your name and Caleb's. No claims from my estate, regardless of what happens to me. Medical care for your father, funded for as long as he lives. School fees for your brother through graduation. And a written agreement that you can leave Ironwood Ridge with your family's security intact if you decide in 6 months that it isn't workable." Nora uncrossed her arms slowly. Her chest felt tight. "Why me, specifically?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because you didn't sign," he said. "When Pratt pushed that pen at you and stood over your father's sickbed with $1 amount, you found your way to that bank and you tried to negotiate first. Most people in your position would have signed and wept. You didn't." He paused. "That matters to me." It was not a romantic thing to say. It was possibly the least romantic proposal Nora had ever heard. But something about the directness of it, the absence of flattery, the plain accounting of what he'd observed, made it land differently than pretty words would have. She looked down at the boardwalk. She thought about her father lying in his bed at home, with Caleb sitting next to him, trying to look calm. She thought about the deed in her coat pocket and the pen she had almost picked up. She thought about what the next 6 months looked like if she walked away from this conversation. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me. First, the written agreements you described. I want them specific. Amounts, timelines, legal language. I want a lawyer to look at them, not just your word. There's a lawyer on the next street over. We can use her." Nora blinked. "Her, Margaret Hollis, she's good. Been practicing longer than either of us has been alive." Nora filed that away. "Second, I want to meet you there at the ranch, before I agree to stay permanently." You show me what it actually is and who actually lives there. Then I decide whether 6 months is worth attempting." He nodded. "Third," she looked at him directly, "you don't lie to me. Whatever is actually going on with your land and why you need a legal spouse, you tell me the truth of it. Not now, not on the street, but you tell me." Gideon Rourke looked at her for a long moment. The sun was high, and the heat was starting to press down on the street in that particular way it did in Texas in summer, like the sky was leaning on you. "Agreed," he said. Margaret Hollis's office smelled like old paper and ink, and the faint trace of the cigars she smoked when she thought no one was watching, though the stub in her ashtray told a different story. She was 70 if she was a day, with white hair pinned severely and eyes that had the particular sharpness of a person who spent decades watching people try to deceive her. She read the agreement Gideon had outlined. Then she looked at him over her spectacles. "This is what you're offering." "In those terms, yes." "And the Whitlock farm deed is to be secured how?" "Exactly." "Filed this afternoon, simultaneous with the marriage record. Her name and her brother's name as joint holders. No claims from my estate or from any creditors of mine." Margaret Hollis turned to Nora. "You understand what you're signing." "I'm beginning to," Nora said. Margaret looked at her for another long moment with those sharp eyes. Then she looked back at the agreement. "I have revisions." She picked up her pen and began writing without asking permission. "The medical provision needs a defined funding mechanism, not just a promise. The school provision should extend through any further education the boy chooses, not just through graduation. And this phrase here," she tapped the paper, "about leaving with your security intact. I'm changing it to specify that the security is absolute and non-negotiable, regardless of the circumstances under which she leaves." "Understood?" Gideon looked at the page. "Understood." "Good." Margaret kept writing. "Now, why does a man who can pay off 3 years of drought debt in cash need a wife recorded by this afternoon?" Gideon said nothing. Margaret looked up. "I'm her attorney. You've agreed to tell her the truth of it. That agreement starts now, in this room." The silence stretched. Nora watched Gideon's jaw tighten. He was not a man who was used to being required to explain himself. She could see that. But he also wasn't a man who had agreed to something and then decided not to honor it. "There are contracts on my land," he said. "Old ones, written before my father died. They carry a provision that transfers certain controlling interests to another party if the owner dies without a legal heir or spouse. My lawyers have been fighting the provision for 2 years. They haven't resolved it." "Who holds the contracts?" Margaret asked. "A man named Silas Vane, land commissioner." Margaret's pen stopped moving. She looked up at Gideon with an expression that was no longer simply professional. "Silas Vane," she said. "You know him," Gideon said. "I know of him," Margaret said carefully, "as do most lawyers who've practiced in this state for more than 20 years. She set her pen down. "How long has he been after Ironwood Ridge?" "Since my father was alive." "And your father died 3 years ago." The circumstances were never fully explained. The room was very quiet. Nora looked at Gideon. He was looking at the desk. Something in his expression told her that this was not a topic he had not thought about. It was a topic he had thought about every day for 3 years and had not been able to resolve. And that particular kind of stuck grief sat differently on a person than ordinary sorrow. "I see," Margaret said. She picked up her pen again. "Then let's make certain this agreement is unassailable." She began writing more quickly, and Nora had the sense that the older woman was doing something more than drafting a contract. She was building something, a wall, maybe, or the beginning of one. The justice of the peace was a thin man named Dorsey, who looked like he had performed a great many weddings and found most of them unremarkable. He did not find this one remarkable either. He read the words, they said the words, and Nora Whitlock signed her name as Nora Rourke on a piece of paper at 2:15 in the afternoon, in the county seat of Dry Creek, Texas, standing in a room that smelled like dust and old law books, wearing the same plain dress she'd come to town in that morning. Gideon signed beside her. His handwriting was precise. Dorsey stamped the record. "Congratulations," he said, in the tone of a man who says it 20 times a week. Nora folded her copy of the agreement and the marriage record and put them in her coat pocket with the deed. Her coat was getting heavy. Do you need to see your father before we go? Gideon asked. Yes. She looked at him. He doesn't know. No. He wouldn't have agreed. My father has opinions about self-sufficiency. I expect most men who spent their lives building something do. Nora looked at him sideways. Is that something you understand personally? He looked at her for just a moment. Yes. Her father was awake when she arrived, which was better than it had been some days. He was propped against the pillows Caleb had arranged for him that morning, and his face had the yellowish, hollowed look that had been settling on him for months now. But his eyes were clear, and when Nora sat down on the edge of the bed and took his hand, he squeezed back with more strength than she expected. You look different, he said. I'm fine, Papa. What happened at the bank? Nora told him. Not all of it. She told him the debt was cleared and the medical bills were paid, and that the deed was secured in her name and Caleb's. She told him she had married a rancher from up in the mountains and that the arrangement protected the farm. Her father was quiet for a long time after she finished. He was not a man who responded quickly to things. He processed things the way water moves, through slowly, thoroughly, and in ways that didn't show on the surface until they were finished. Is he a good man? He finally asked. Nora thought about Gideon Rourke, the way he'd walked into that bank, the way he'd counted out money without theater or pity, the way he'd looked at her on the street direct and assessing and without flattery. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Her father squeezed her hand again. Fair answer, he said, fair answer. Caleb took it worse. He was 16 and he had his father's jaw and his mother's temper and the specific fury of a boy who has watched his family suffer and had no power to stop it and was now being presented with evidence that his sister had solved it without him. You married a stranger, he said flat. I did. Because of money. Because of a lot of things. Nora. He stopped, looked at the floor. When he looked back up, his voice was lower. Was there another way? Nora met his eyes. I looked, she said. There wasn't one I could find in time. Caleb pressed his lips together. He was trying not to cry, she could see it, the effort of it in his jaw, in the set of his shoulders. He was too old to cry about it and too young not to want to. I'm coming back, she said. This isn't forever. It's an arrangement. What if he's terrible? Then in 6 months I leave, and everything we just gained stays ours. It's in the contract. You got a contract. Margaret Hollis wrote it. Caleb blinked. Even he had heard of Margaret Hollis. Okay, he said after a moment. Okay. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, quick and dismissive, the way teenage boys do when they've been caught feeling something. You'd better write to me. Every week. And if anything feels wrong. I'll say so. He nodded. He still looked afraid. She hugged him, which he tolerated for about 3 seconds and then pulled back from with dignity mostly intact. She held on for those 3 seconds as hard as she could. The wagon Gideon had waiting was better than she expected, which was either a good sign or the beginning of more surprises. One of his ranch hands, a quiet man named Dex, who acknowledged Nora with a nod so economical it barely moved his head, loaded the 2 bags she'd packed into the wagon bed without being asked. Gideon sat up front. Nora sat beside him. They rode out of Dry Creek without ceremony. Nobody on the street watched. Nobody knew what they were watching anyway. She supposed just a woman in a plain dress, sitting next to a man in a dusty coat on an ordinary wagon, heading out of town on an ordinary afternoon. Nothing about it looked like the beginning of anything. The road climbed for the first hour, which Nora expected. The mountains above Dry Creek were visible from the valley, on clear days rolling dark shapes to the north and west, the kind that looked close until you tried to reach them. What she did not expect was how long the climb was. 2 hours out of town, the road narrowed. The wagon moved slower. The country around them changed from dry grassland to something with more rock in it, more shade, deeper ravines that dropped away on one side, and steep slopes on the other. Gideon drove without comment. Nora watched the landscape change and thought about the agreement in her pocket and did not speak. It was Gideon who broke the silence first, which surprised her. You grew up on the farm? He asked. Born there. My mother died when I was 11. I took over the house after that. And the accounts? My father taught me the bookkeeping when I was 14. He said. She paused. This was more than she'd intended to say. He said the most dangerous kind of poverty is the kind you can't see coming because you weren't watching the numbers. He's right. She looked at him. Do you do your own books? I do, or did, before whatever's happening with Vane made that complicated. He glanced at her sideways. You pay attention. Margaret Hollis wasn't subtle. No, he agreed. She isn't. A pause. The ledgers have been reviewed by my lawyers. They're satisfied. Are you? He didn't answer right away. There are inconsistencies I've attributed to management errors. Minor things. Nothing that proves anything. But they bother you. Yes. Nora looked out at the road. The wagon rattled over a rough patch and settled again. Show me when we get there, she said. If you want a second pair of eyes. He looked at her again. You've never seen commercial cattle ledgers. No. But I've been finding errors in my father's account since I was 15, and his were a mess, and the principles aren't different. Numbers that don't match have reasons. The reasons are usually simple once you know where to look. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then I'll show you. They passed through the gates at dusk. The gates themselves were the first indication that something was different. They were iron, heavy, set into a stone arch that had been built by someone who knew what they were doing and had enough material to do it right. A man stood on one side of them armed, watching, who relaxed slightly when he recognized the wagon and pulled the gate open with the practiced motion of someone who did it daily. Evening, Mr. Rourke, the man said. Then he looked at Nora. Said nothing, but his expression registered something surprise, maybe, or recalibration. Gideon nodded at him and drove through. Beyond the gates, the road widened again. It curved through a stand of trees, real trees, which meant real water nearby, and then around a long bend, and then. Nora stopped breathing for a moment. The house was stone, 3 stories, built into the hillside like it had grown there. The windows were lit from inside, warm against the darkening sky. Round it spread structures she couldn't fully make out in the failing light, large barns, long bunkhouses, other buildings she couldn't name yet. And beyond those, stretching away into the shadows in every direction, pasture. Enormous, uninterrupted pasture, the kind that takes years to fence and more years to maintain, the kind that means something very different from a poor farmer's plot. She had thought she was marrying a man with a rough cabin and a modest herd. She was looking at an empire. This, she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended, is Ironwood Ridge? Yes, said Gideon. She turned to look at him. He was watching her face with an expression that was carefully held, not quite uncertain, but alert. Like he was waiting for something. Why didn't you tell me, she said. Because people who know what this is worth change how they act around it. He paused. I needed to know how you'd act before you knew. Nora looked back at the house. She counted windows. She thought about the numbers she'd discussed in Margaret Hollis's office, the debt she owed, the money Gideon had counted out like it was nothing, the satchel that hadn't emptied. She thought about a man who could do that without a flicker of financial concern. The debt you paid, she said. That was manageable. Manageable, she repeated. The medical expenses also. She stopped. Reorganized. How much of this is yours? Nearly 40,000 acres. Most of the cattle you'll see tomorrow. Some of the horses are worth more individually than your family's farm. Nora sat with that for a moment. The wagon had stopped. Dex was already at the back, handling the bags, doing it with the efficiency of a man who didn't need to be told what to do. The warm light from the house fell across the yard. Silas Vane wants all of this, she said. He's been trying to take it since before my father died, Gideon said. He almost succeeded twice. The contracts my father signed before he understood what Vane was, those are the mechanism. Get rid of me, and the mechanism triggers. And if you have a legal wife on record, the mechanism fails. The contracts require the owner to die without a spouse or heir. I'm no longer without a spouse. He paused. That's not nothing. That's the beginning of dismantling everything Vane built. Nora looked at him. In the low light, his face was harder to read than it had been in the brightness of Dry Creek's Main Street. But she thought she understood something about him, now that she hadn't understood before. Something about why he'd walked into that bank, why he'd watched her specifically. Why he'd chosen her instead of any of the other desperate women in any of the other desperate situations that a man with this kind of money could have resolved. He didn't need someone who would be grateful. He needed someone who would look at a problem and think. The ledger inconsistencies, she said. They bother you because you think someone inside the ranch is feeding information to Vane. Gideon was still for a moment. Yes. And you haven't confronted them because you're not sure who it is and you don't want to warn the wrong person. Yes. And you haven't resolved on the contracts because your lawyers are working on a legal problem, but you think the real problem is something they can't see from where they're standing. The stillness in his face broke slightly, not into warmth exactly, but something in the vicinity of recognition. Yes, he said. Nora climbed down from the wagon. Her boots hit the ground and she looked up at the house, at the lit windows, the heavy stone walls, the scale of it against the darkening sky. Show me the ledgers tomorrow, she said. Tonight I'd like to see the kitchen and find out if there's enough for supper, because we've been on that road for 4 hours, and I haven't eaten since morning. Behind her, she heard something that might have been the beginning of a laugh, stopped before it finished. It was such a small sound, and so quickly suppressed, that she wasn't sure she'd heard it at all. She walked toward the door without waiting for him. The housekeeper was a broad-shouldered woman in her 50s named Clara, who managed the expression of someone who had been told to expect a new wife and was reserving judgment entirely. She showed Nora to a room on the second floor that was larger than her family's entire main floor, with windows that looked out over the south pasture, and told her supper would be ready in 20 minutes. The household staff, Clara said, pausing at the door, is 12, not counting the ranch hands. I run them. If you have questions about the house, come to me. I will, Nora said. What time does the house start in the morning? Clara blinked, like she'd expected something else. 5:30. Coffee's ready by 5. Good. 5 works for me. Nora set her bag on the chair near the window. Thank you, Clara. Clara looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, then nodded once and left. Nora sat down on the edge of the bed. She put her hands in her lap. She looked at the room around her, the wood floors, the good furniture, the curtains on the windows. She thought about her father in his narrow bed at home, with Caleb sitting next to him. She thought about the deed in her coat pocket, with her name on it, secured. She thought about Silas Vane, and fraudulent contracts, and a man whose father had died under circumstances that were never explained. She'd married a stranger to save her family. She'd known that walking in. What she hadn't known was that the stranger was fighting a war. She pulled the contract out of her pocket and read it again, from the beginning. Every line, every amendment Margaret Hollis had written in her precise hand. It was solid. It was real. It was the most protection she'd ever held in her hands. Then she folded it, put it in the drawer of the nightstand, and went down to supper. Gideon was already at the table when she came in. He stood when she entered automatically, like he'd been taught to and hadn't thought to stop. She sat across from him. The food was simple, and there was enough of it. They ate mostly without speaking, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who are too tired and too full of information to make conversation, and who understand that about each other without needing to say it. Near the end of the meal, Gideon set down his fork and said, "You asked me why I chose you specifically. I remember. In the bank. Before you'd agreed to anything. You didn't look at the money first." He picked up his fork again. Most people, when someone puts money on a table in front of them, look at the money. You looked at me. Nora considered this. And that mattered? Yes. She thought about what else she wanted to say, and decided to say only part of it. I looked at you because I was trying to decide if you were dangerous. What did you decide? I decided you were dangerous in a way that wasn't aimed at me. She paused. I'm still not certain I was right. He looked at her across the table. The lamplight between them was the color of old brass. You're right, he said. But there's enough danger aimed at this ranch to make the distinction complicated. Nora nodded. That was honest enough for a first evening. I'll look at the ledgers in the morning, she said. But I want to walk the property first. I need to understand what I'm looking at before the numbers mean anything. Gideon looked at her. I'll take you out at first light. Good. She pushed back her chair. Good night, Mr. Rourke. Gideon, he said. She paused at the door. Good night, Gideon. She went upstairs to the room with the curtains and the view of the south pasture, and she lay down on the wide bed in her clothes and looked at the ceiling and thought about 40,000 acres and Silas Vane and a man who had watched her long enough to know she didn't look at money first. Outside, somewhere far across the dark pasture, cattle moved. She could hear them, low, patient sounds in the distance, the sound of something enormous and alive, breathing in the dark. She was still thinking when she fell asleep. She was up before Clara had the coffee ready. The south pasture looked different in the dark before dawn than it had through the window the night before. It looked bigger, the kind of big that doesn't register properly until you're standing inside it, where the edges disappear into something that isn't quite darkness and isn't quite morning yet, just the waiting space between them. Gideon was already in the yard when Nora came out. He had 2 horses saddled, a gray mare, and a dark bay that stood taller than anything she'd ridden on her family's farm. He was checking the cinch on the gray with the automatic attention of a man who checks things, not because he doubts they were done right, but because he has learned not to assume. He looked up when she came down the porch steps. He didn't say anything about the hour, or that she'd been faster than expected. He just handed her the gray's reins. She's steady, he said. Good mouth. Nora took the reins. She ran a hand along the mare's neck, let the horse smell her wrist. The mare exhaled and settled. What's her name? Pearl. Nora put her foot in the stirrup and swung up. She'd ridden farm horses her whole life, shorter, broader, built for pulling rather than covering ground. Pearl felt different under her, lighter and more collected, and Nora took a moment to adjust her weight and find her balance before she asked anything of the horse. Gideon mounted the bay without ceremony and turned south. Nora followed. They rode for the first 20 minutes without talking, which suited her. The sky was doing that slow thing it does in the Texas hill country before sunrise, going from black to a dark indigo, blue to something with red in it, the colors arriving like they were being decided one at a time. The grass was damp with dew. Pearl's hooves were quiet in it. Gideon pulled up on a rise and let his horse stand, and Nora came up beside him and looked out at what he was showing her. It went in every direction. Grassland, managed and dense, stretching to tree lines that marked creek beds and property boundaries she couldn't see clearly yet. Cattle moved in clusters, dozens of them, in the nearest pasture, more in the distance. Fences ran in straight lines that meant money and labor and years of work. A windmill turned slowly near a tank that caught the first light on its surface. How many head? She asked. About 4,200 right now. We sold off 500 in spring. The horses? 80 some. 12 are breeding stock. The rest are working horses or stock we're training for sale. Nora looked at the water tank. Where does the water come from? 3 creeks cross the property, 2 springs on the west side. We've got water rights that go back to when my grandfather built the first structure on this land. Vane wants those, too. The water rights make the land worth twice what it would be without them. Without the water, this is just difficult terrain. With it, he stopped. With it, it's the most valuable parcel in the county, Nora finished. In 3 counties, Gideon said. She looked at him. He was watching the cattle below them with the particular attention of a man who can read a herd the way other people read text, noticing things that look like nothing to her but mean something specific to him. There was something almost peaceful about his face when he looked at the land, and she thought that was probably the most honest thing she'd seen from him since yesterday. Whatever else he was holding back, this was real. Your father built this? She asked. My father and his father before him. My grandfather came out here with $60 and a team of mules and the kind of stubbornness that looks like stupidity until it doesn't. A pause. My father added the water rights, fought for them legally for 11 years before he got full title. And then Vane came. Vane was already here. He was my father's friend, or played one well enough. He helped broker the water rights settlement, actually. Sat at our table, ate our food. Gideon's jaw tightened slightly. Contracts my father signed trusting him were written to give Vane a legal foothold if my father died. My father thought they were routine business agreements. They were not. Nora watched the cattle below. Did your father know at the end what Vane was? He found out. That's another pause, longer this time. That's what I believe. He called his lawyer the week before he died. The meeting never happened. The red in the sky was turning orange now. Pearl shifted under her, and Nora steadied the horse without thinking about it, her hand already adjusted, already reading the animal. You think Vane killed him, she said. I think my father died of a fall from a horse he'd ridden for 8 years on ground he knew better than I do. Gideon looked at her steadily. And I think that is very unlikely to be an accident. Nora held that. She thought about her own father in his bed at home, and the way his hands had looked ruined and mapped with work, the hands of a man who had built something with his body over decades. She thought about what it would feel like to know someone had taken that from him deliberately and called it misfortune. All right, she said. Let's go back and look at the ledgers. The office was on the ground floor of the house, past the dining room, a room that smelled like its primary purpose had always been serious work. The desk was large and dark and scarred from use. The shelves behind it held ledgers in careful rows, years of them, each spine marked with a year and a category. Gideon pulled 6 books from the last 2 years and set them on the desk without explanation. Nora sat down and opened the first one. She did not start where most people would start, at the beginning. She went to the middle and found a pattern first. The rhythm of the entries, the way the columns were organized, what categories existed, and how they were named. Then she went back to the front and began reading with that pattern in her head. Gideon stood near the window. He didn't try to guide her or explain what she was looking at. She appreciated that more than she would have said. Took her about 40 minutes to find the first irregularity. Your supply purchases, she said. Who places the orders? The foreman coordinates with the supply manager. Harlan Pikey's been foreman here for 12 years. Good man. Knew my father. What's your usual arrangement with the Dallow dry goods supplier? The one out of Kerrville? Gideon moved to the desk. He looked at the line she was pointing to. We negotiate quarterly. Fixed rate per unit on feed, salt blocks equipment. Then why is this invoice $4 a unit above the contracted rate? He looked at it. He took the book from her and looked at it more closely, then went to the shelf and pulled another ledger, cross-referencing. His face changed, not dramatically, but the particular stillness that came over it told her he was working hard at keeping whatever he was feeling off his expression. He stopped. That's not the contracted rate. No, and it's not a single mistake. Look. She took the book back and turned to 4 other pages she'd marked with her finger. Each one showed the same kind of discrepancy, small enough to miss on a quick review, not small enough to be meaningless. Across these 6 months, it adds up to, she did the math in her head, somewhere near $4,000. Gideon put both hands on the desk and looked at the numbers without speaking. There's more, Nora said. The payroll entries. Do you have men who appear on payroll without corresponding housing or meal records? Ranch hands who eat and sleep somewhere have a footprint. If someone's being paid who doesn't have that footprints. Show me, she showed him. It took another hour. By the end of it, 3 names appeared on payroll records without any corresponding presence in the bunkhouse logs, the meal tallies, or the work assignment sheets. 3 men being paid for work that left no record of being done, out of a budget line that was buried in a category labeled Seasonal Labor Adjustment. Gideon straightened up. He looked at the wall. He said nothing for a long moment. The money is going somewhere, Nora said carefully. And someone on this ranch is managing the books in a way that obscures where. That's not a clerical error. That's deliberate. I know. His voice was flat and controlled, the way a person sounds when they're holding something at arm's length by effort. The name you trust most on this property, she said. Who is it? He didn't answer right away. Harlan Pike, he said finally. The foreman. Yes. Who coordinates the supply orders? Silence. I'm not accusing him, Nora said. She kept her voice even. I'm telling you the thread starts there. It could go through him or it could go around him. But we find out by following the thread, not by pulling it. Gideon turned and looked at her. Something had changed in his expression. She couldn't name it exactly. Not softened. More like the hard surface of it had developed a specific crack. My father trusted Harlan, he said. When he died, Harlan was the one who held this operation together while I got back here. He's worked this land for longer than I've been running it. I know, Nora said. That makes it worse if it's him. It doesn't change what the numbers say. Gideon walked to the window and looked out at the yard. What do you want to do? Nothing yet, she said. We don't move until we know where the thread ends. If we confront Harlan now and he's connected to Vane, Vane gets warned. We lose our advantage. Our advantage, Gideon said, and there was something in the way he said it, not mocking, but noticing. Our advantage, she said again, without apology. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once like something had been decided. Harlan Pike came in for his morning report at 9. He was a thick-shouldered man in his late 40s, with a graying beard and the permanent squint of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. He moved through the house with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had been in it regularly for years, and he knocked on the open office door and stepped halfway in before he registered that Nora was sitting at the desk. Stopped, looked at her, looked at Gideon. His expression ran through several things quickly before settling into something neutral. Morning, Harlan, Gideon said from where he stood near the window. Morning. Harlan's eyes came back to Nora. This is my wife, Nora. A pause. The word landed in the room, and Harlan looked at it the way a man looks at something he didn't see coming and needs a second to process. Your wife, he said. Married yesterday afternoon. Gideon's voice was easy. Practiced. She's going to be helping with the household accounts. Getting familiar with how things run. Harlan looked at Nora again. She looked back at him, calm and unhurried, her hands resting on the closed ledger on the desk. Welcome, he said after a moment. The word came out neutral. Thank you, Nora said. I'm sorry for the surprise. It was sudden. Sure. He shifted his attention back to Gideon and ran through his reportal in the East pasture that needed moving. A fence line in the north sector that was showing where, the feed delivery scheduled for Thursday. He spoke efficiently and from memory, the marks of a man who was genuinely good at his job or had learned very well how to perform that. Gideon asked the right questions. He didn't ask anything that would signal what the ledgers had shown. Nora watched Harlan's hands while he talked. They were steady, relaxed, the hands of a man who felt safe. Either he didn't know they'd found the discrepancies, or he did know and he was better at this than she'd hoped. When Harlan left, Gideon waited until the sound of his boots had cleared the hall. Then he looked at Nora. Well, he said. He was watching you more than he watched me, she said. He was checking whether you'd changed. Whether I knew something. Yes. He was trying to read your face. And you gave him nothing. She paused. That was well done. Something crossed Gideon's expression that might have been grim satisfaction. I've been managing my face around that man since my father died. It's not new. He pulled the office door almost closed. So we watch him, and we find a way to give him something false to pass along. Something specific enough that when it reaches Vane, we know exactly where it came from and how it got there. Gideon was quiet. You're talking about using him as a channel. I'm talking about using the fact that he thinks we don't know. That's a resource. Spend it right, and we get something worth more than catching one man padding a payroll. Gideon looked at her with that expression that wasn't quite anything she had a name for yet. What kind of false information? Something Vane would act on. Something that would force him to move before he's ready. She thought about it. If Vane believes you're considering an outside sale, that you've made contact with a competing land buyer, he'd have to accelerate whatever he's planning. Men who are trying to position for a legal seizure don't do well when the target looks like it might slip another way. A false sale negotiation, a rumor of one. Just enough detail to be credible, not enough to be verifiable quickly, she paused. And when Vane moves in response, we'll know two things. That the channel works, and what Vane considers a threat worth responding to. Gideon sat down across from her. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the desk. You've thought about this kind of thing before. I've thought about how to survive things before, she said. This is the same kind of thinking. He was quiet for a moment. If we do this and it works, Vane finds out eventually that he was misled. He won't respond moderately. No, she agreed. He has reach. What happened to my father? He can do that to people who get in his way. Nora looked at him directly. I know what I'm walking into, she said. You told me last night there was enough danger here to make things complicated. I'm not pretending otherwise. You have family in Dry Creek. It hit because he meant it to, not cruelly as a fact she needed to hold. He was right. Caleb was there. Her father was there. Then we do this right, she said. We do it completely enough that by the time Vane realizes what happened, he doesn't have the ability to reach anyone. Gideon held her gaze for a long moment. Whatever calculation he was making, he took his time with it. All right, he said. Then we need to decide what we tell Harlan. 3 days later, a barn burned. Nora was in the office going through a third set of ledgers when she smelled the smoke. She was at the window before she'd consciously decided to move, and from there she could see the orange light at the far end of the south pasture, the old hay barn. The one Gideon had mentioned was due for expansion, fully lit and throwing sparks into the dark sky. She ran. The yard was already chaos by the time she got outside. Ranch hands running with buckets, someone leading horses away from the adjacent corral, voices overlapping. Gideon was already there. She didn't know how he'd gotten there first, but he was at the corral gate directing men with the clipped efficiency of someone who had thought about what to do in this situation before it happened. The horses are out, he said when he saw her, without turning his head. Don't go near the barn. How did it start? Don't know yet. She looked at the barn. The fire was advanced. It had been burning for some time before anyone smelled it, which meant it had started in a place that didn't produce visible smoke immediately, or it had been lit deliberately with that in mind. Harlan, she said quietly, moving close enough that only Gideon could hear her. I know. He didn't look at her. He kept watching the barn and his men. We sent the rumor 2 days ago. The fire is a response. He's sending a message. Vane's sending a message. Through whatever means he has. Gideon's jaw was set. This is warning us off. It's also a mistake, Nora said. If he's reacting this fast to a rumor, the rumor hit something real. He's scared of a competing buyer. Gideon looked at her then, briefly in the orange light. His eyes were hard and tired, and something else underneath that she couldn't name. The barn is a loss. There was equipment in there worth. I know, she said, but the information we got from it is worth more than the barn. He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned back to his men. She stood in the smoky dark beside him and watched the old structure burn down to its bones and thought about Silas Vane sitting somewhere comfortable believing he'd just delivered a warning that would be received. He had delivered a message. He'd just misjudged who was reading it. The cattle poisoning happened 9 days later. 11 head in the east pasture found dead at the water tank they shared with an adjacent section. Gideon had the veterinarian out within hours. The diagnosis was clear: something introduced to the tank deliberately, at a concentration that required specific knowledge of how much water the animals were consuming. Nora stood at the fence watching the hands work and thought about the level of knowledge that required. Not a casual saboteur, someone who understood livestock water consumption. Someone who had spent time on a ranch. It's not just about damage, she said to Gideon when they were back at the house. I know, he was at the window again. He spent a lot of time at windows, she'd noticed, not looking for anything specific, just keeping the land in his field of vision, like losing sight of it was a risk he wasn't willing to take. It's about cost, she said. He's not trying to destroy you all at once. He's bleeding you. Every fire, every loss, it adds to the financials. If your books show years of unexplained losses, it becomes easier to argue in court that the ranch is being mismanaged, that a change in oversight is warranted. Gideon turned from the window. You think he's building a legal paper trail? I think the falsified ledger entries, the losses from sabotage, the fraudulent invoices, they all tell a story when you put them together. A story about a ranch that can't sustain itself, which makes the case for intervention. For Vane to step in under the contract provision. Yes. Nora pulled the ledger she'd been working with from the shelf. Which means the ledger work we're doing is more urgent than I thought. We're not just documenting theft. We're building a counter-record. Evidence that the losses aren't from mismanagement, they're from deliberate external sabotage. Gideon looked at her. His expression had that quality again. Not warmth, but the specific attention of someone recalibrating something. I need a letter, he said abruptly. She looked up. To whom? My lawyer in Austin. I need to outline what we found in the ledgers. Not everything yet, just enough to alert him to what we're building. He paused. But I need it written in a way that's clear and specific, and doesn't give anything away if the wrong person sees it. I can write that, Nora said. I know. He hesitated. I know you can. It was a small thing to say, but in the way he said it, without the hesitation of a man who's uncertain, and without the overcorrection of a man trying to seem gracious, it landed as simply true. He knew. He'd watched her work for 9 days. He was stating a fact. Opened the ledger to a clean page and picked up a pen. The false accusation arrived 11 days after the poisoning, in the form of a letter from the county insurance office. Gideon brought it to the breakfast table and read it twice and set it down with the careful control of a man who understood that putting it through the window would cost him the window and accomplish nothing. What does it say? Nora asked. It says there's a formal inquiry into the barn fire. They have information suggesting it may have been set intentionally for the insurance claim. He looked up. By me. Nora set down her coffee. Who filed the information? Anonymous report. His voice was very even. But the insurance investigator named is out of Kerrville. That office is... He stopped. Is what? 2 years ago, my lawyer flagged that the county insurance commissioner had taken contributions from a company called Meridian Land Holdings. Meridian is one of the corporate names Vane operates through. Nora looked at the letter. So he owns the investigator. He's got reach into that office, at minimum, which means the investigation won't be neutral. She picked up the letter and read it herself. The language was careful, formal, bureaucratic, just on the right side of accusatory. Designed to create a record, she thought. Another piece of the paper trail. When does the inquiry meet? 3 weeks. That's not enough time to challenge the investigator's conflicts of interest through normal channels. No. Nora put the letter down. She looked at the table for a moment, thinking. We need someone outside this county, she said. Someone with jurisdiction above the county level. A federal inquiry would supersede a county insurance investigation. Gideon looked at her carefully. What kind of federal matter? Fraud, potentially. Wire fraud if any of the communications crossed state lines. Conspiracy to deprive someone of property rights. She paused. Falsified contracts. The bribery of county officials. If we can show a pattern which we're building in the ledgers, this isn't just a local land dispute. It's organized fraud. Federal investigators don't take cases because a rancher asks them to. No, she said. But they take cases when someone presents them with organized, documented evidence of a pattern that implicates multiple officials across multiple counties. She looked at him. Which is what we're building. Gideon sat back in his chair. He looked at her with that expression that was becoming familiar to her, the one that wasn't quite surprise, because he'd stopped being surprised by her, but hadn't yet decided what to replace that with. You've been thinking about this since we looked at the ledgers, he said. Since before that, she said honestly. Since Margaret Hollis said his name and her pen stopped moving. He was quiet for a moment. Somewhere outside, she could hear the ranch beginning its morning, the sound of men and horses and work. The ordinary sounds of a place that was still alive because they were still holding it. I was told something this morning, he said, by one of my men. Someone approached Caleb. Nora went still. In town, Gideon said. Yesterday. A man Caleb didn't know. Said something to him about how it was a shame his sister had gotten mixed up in something that might turn dangerous. He paused. Caleb told the man to go to hell and came home and told your neighbor, who sent word to me. Nora's hands were flat on the table. She could feel her pulse in them. He's threatening my brother, she said. The words came out level because she worked to make them level. He's trying to make you want to leave. I know what he's trying to do. She looked at Gideon. Caleb all right? He's fine. He's 16 and angry, and apparently not easy to frighten. Something crossed Gideon's face that in another context might have been almost a smile. Your neighbor described him as having, quote, said his piece clearly, and with vocabulary she didn't expect from a boy his age. Nora let out a slow breath. She thought about Caleb, his jaw set, his voice controlled, the way he'd looked at her the day she'd left. He was going to be fine. He was also going to be furious at her for worrying about him, which was itself reassuring. I want him here, she said, or I want someone in Dry Creek watching him. One or the other. I already sent 2 men. She looked at him. When? An hour ago, before I showed you the letter. The thing about this man, she was discovering, was that he acted on things before he said them. He had been watching her long enough before he walked into that bank to have made a decision. He had cleared her debt before explaining why. He had sent men to her brother before delivering the news that made that necessary. It was not the way she was used to being treated. She was used to being the one who handled things. Being in a situation where someone else had already handled it and handled it correctly was strange and slightly disorienting in a way she didn't have language for yet. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head once, dismissing the thanks. "He's your brother. That makes him my concern." Nora looked at the table, then at the window, then back at Gideon. "We need to move faster," she said. Vane is escalating. The barn, the cattle, the false accusation. Now my family. He's throwing things at us to see what sticks. He doesn't know what we have yet, Gideon said. "No, but he knows we're not running." She picked up the letter again. "Which means we're getting close to something he's afraid of. Otherwise this," she set the letter down, "wouldn't be necessary." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. "What do you need?" "All the original contracts. Everything your father signed. Everything Vane's name appears on. I need them in this office, and I need time to go through every line." She stood up. "And I need you to understand that what I'm looking for probably isn't what your lawyers looked for. They were looking for legal vulnerabilities. I'm looking for mistakes." "What kind of mistakes?" "The kind men make when they think they're smart enough not to make them." She moved toward the office door. "Vane has been doing this for years. That means he has a method. And methods have patterns. And patterns have gaps." She went into the office and began pulling files, and behind her she heard the sound of Gideon's chair pushing back as he stood to help her. And neither of them said anything more because there was nothing left to say that wasn't better said by the work itself. Outside, the ranch turned through its morning. Cattle and horses and the ordinary machinery of a place being held together by people who refused to let it go. And Nora Whitlock, Nora Rourke spread papers across a desk in the mountains and began looking for the crack in an empire of lies. The way her father had taught her to look for errors in accounts, one line at a time, without hurry, without flinching, until the number that didn't match finally showed her where the truth was hiding. Contracts were older than she'd expected. Nora had been prepared for paperworks. She'd asked for it, spread it across the office desk, arranged it by date and category the way her father had taught her to approach anything that needed to be understood rather than just read. What she hadn't been prepared for was how far back it went. The oldest document in the pile was dated 19 years prior, signed by Gideon's father in handwriting that was confident and slightly hurried, the handwriting of a man who trusted the person handing him the pen. She read through the night on the first pass. Not carefully, just moving through, getting the shape of things, the way you walk a piece of land before you try to work it. Gideon sat across from her for the first 2 hours, going through a separate set of correspondence his lawyer had sent up, and then around midnight he fell asleep in the chair, which she suspected he wouldn't have done if he'd known he was doing it. She let him sleep. He'd been running on short hours for longer than she'd been here. She could see that in him. The particular kind of exhaustion that becomes structural. By 3 in the morning, she had a list of 12 things that didn't sit right. By 5, she had narrowed it to 4 that were serious. By 6, when the sky outside was doing its slow color change and Pearl was moving in the paddock below the window, she had found the one that mattered. She sat with it for a long time before she woke Gideon. "Here," she said, when he'd straightened up in the chair and rubbed his face and accepted the coffee Clara had left outside the door. She pointed to the page in front of her. "This contract. The one from 11 years ago. The one that carries the provision about spousal inheritance." Gideon looked at it. He'd looked at this document before she could tell, from the way his eyes moved over it, the resigned familiarity of a man reviewing a problem that has defeated him repeatedly. "My lawyers reviewed it thoroughly. I know. They were looking at the language. The provisions, the legal interpretation." She pointed to the bottom of the page. "I'm looking at the certification." He leaned forward. "This document was supposed to be certified by the county land office," she said. "You see this stamp here, county seal? signature line, certification date. Your lawyers looked at the substance of the contract. They looked at whether the provisions were enforceable. She kept her finger on the stamp. But look at the certification date. Gideon looked. That date, she said, is 3 days before the contract was signed. Silence. She let it sit, because it needed to sit for a moment. The simplicity of it, the audacity of it, the way something enormous could hinge on something that small. The county certified a document that didn't exist yet, Gideon said, which means either the certification was backdated, or a blank form was certified and the contract language was filled in afterward. Either way, she looked at him. The certification is fraudulent. And a fraudulent certification means the contract was never legally valid. Gideon stared at the page. He picked it up. He put it down. Picked it up again and looked at the date with the expression of a man who has been fighting something for years and has just discovered that the thing he was fighting was made of paper. My lawyers missed this, he said. Your lawyers were looking for legal vulnerabilities. A fraudulent certification isn't a legal argument. It's a procedural fact. It voids the document before you ever get to whether the provisions are enforceable. He set the page down carefully. There are 3 other contracts with similar provisions. I know. I've already checked 2 of them. She turned to her list. One has the same problem certified before signing. Different officials stamp, but the same pattern. The 3rd one I looked at was properly certified, but the signature on it. She turned to another page. The signature on it doesn't match the county commissioner's signature on any other document from that period. Not even close. Gideon leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. He breathed out slowly through his nose. He had someone forge the certifications, he said, or bribe the certifying official to pre-stamp blank forms, which might actually be worse for him legally, because it implicates the county office directly. Nora pulled the pages together into a careful stack. But here's what matters. If the contracts are fraudulent on their face, not just legally questionable, but actually fabricated, then Vane doesn't have a mechanism at all. He has a forgery, and the people who helped him create it are exposed. Gideon looked at her. He looked at her for long enough that she felt it. I need to call my lawyer in Austin, he said. Yes. But not from here. She kept her voice level. If Harlan is still feeding information to Vane, and we have to assume he is until we know otherwise, then a call from this house about the certification flaw goes straight to Vane. He has 12 years of experience covering his tracks. Give him warning and he will bury this. Gideon's jaw tightened. Then how you ride into town? Different office, different line. And you don't tell Harlan you're going. She paused. Tell him you're checking on a fence line in the north sector. Another silence. This one carried something heavier than the others. The specific weight of a man being asked to act as though he doubts someone he has trusted for 12 years. Someone who was there when his father died. Someone whose face he knows as well as his own land. All right, he said. His voice was quiet. All right. He was gone by 7:30. Nora watched the wagon move down the drive from the office window and then turn back to the remaining contracts. She had 2 more to check. She found the 3rd problem in the second-to-last document. Not a certification issue, something different. A payment record attached to the contract, showing a transfer of funds from a holding account she didn't recognize to a legal firm in San Antonio. The amount was specific and large. The notation beside it said consultation fees. Stared at it. The legal firm's name was Aldridge & Carr. She'd seen that name once before in the pile on a letter in Gideon's father's correspondence, written 18 months before his death. The letter was from Aldridge & Carr, and it had reviewed the same contracts now sitting in front of her and declared them sound and properly executed. The firm that had been paid to certify the contracts as legitimate had been paid out of a holding account connected to the same transaction that created the contracts. The lawyer who told Gideon's father the documents were safe had been paid by the man the documents were designed to benefit. Nora sat back in her chair. She had gone looking for a crack and found a foundation made of rot. Gideon came back at midday. He came into the office without taking off his coat, which told her the call had gone urgently enough that he'd come straight here. My lawyer says the certification flaw alone may be enough to void the primary contract, he said. He's already pulling the county records to verify. If the stamp was pre-issued, there's a record of it. There's more, Nora said. She showed him the payment record and the Aldridge and Carr letter. She watched his face go through several things, in sequence recognition, fury, and then something colder than either. The lawyer my father used to review those contracts, Gideon said. Was paid by Vane before the review, she said. The payment is documented. It's in Vane's own transaction records, which your lawyers obtained during the initial challenge, and presumably didn't connect to this document, because they weren't looking at it from this angle. Gideon was very still. My father trusted that review. I know. He signed those contracts because someone he trusted told him they were safe. And that person had already been paid to say so. Yes. The word sat between them. Nora didn't try to soften it. It didn't deserve softening. Vane told my father those documents protected the ranch, Gideon said. His voice was controlled, but something was happening underneath it, something that had been waiting 3 years for a place to land. Told him they were standard arrangements, insurance against uncertainty. My father, he stopped, pressed his lips together. My father wasn't naive. He was careful, he just trusted the wrong man. He trusted a man who spent years making himself trustworthy, Nora said. That's different from being naive. That's being human. Gideon looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the papers on the desk. What do we do with this, he said. We don't take it to the government hearing, Nora said. County inquiry is in 2 weeks. You said yourself the insurance commissioner has ties to Vane's corporate structure. If we present this evidence in a forum Vane has influence over, it disappears. Or it gets procedurally buried. Or the investigator finds a technical reason it can't be admitted. She paused. We need a different arena. Where? Here, she said. Ironwood Ridge. He stared at her. We invite the people who can actually act on this evidence, she said. Not the people Vane has compromised. A federal investigator summoned from outside this state, outside his reach. An investigative journalist, because public record changes the calculation for everyone involved. And a state senator who has been publicly vocal about land fraud and corruption. She'd done her reading in Gideon's library over the past week's newspapers, legislative records, anything that told her who the players were. Senator Aldous Crane. He's been trying to open a formal inquiry into Meridian Land Holdings for 2 years and hasn't been able to get enough documented evidence to force a vote. We'd be giving him that evidence. We'd be giving all 3 of them that evidence. Simultaneously, in the same room, so that no single one of them can be pressured into silence before the others know what they know. She looked at him steadily. And we invite Vane. Gideon's expression went flat. You want Vane here. I want Vane here believing he's won, she said. We send him a message through Harlan. We tell him that the insurance investigation has frightened you. That the false accusation combined with the financial losses has made you reconsider. That you're willing to discuss terms. She kept her voice steady, laying it out the way she'd laid it out in her mind over the past 2 nights. The shape of it, the sequence. He'll come. A man like Vane doesn't send someone else when he thinks he's finally getting what he spent years working for. He'll want to see it himself. And when he gets here, he sits down across from me. Nora paused. And I walk him through every fraudulent document one at a time and give him every opportunity to explain himself. Because men like Vane, when they believe they've won, talk. They explain. They take credit. She looked at Gideon. And when he's said enough, the witnesses come out. The witnesses come out. And the federal officer makes the arrest. And the journalist has a story that can't be suppressed. And Senator Crane has his documented evidence. And Vane's network of compromised officials falls because the federal inquiry supersedes every county and state office he's ever bought. The room was very quiet. Gideon stood up and walked to the window. He stood there looking out at the land, his grandfather's land, the land his father had signed fraudulent documents, trying to protect and died before he could undo the damage. He killed my father, Gideon said. His voice was low and very even. If we do this your way, I never get to. I know, she said. I've wanted to. For 3 years, I know, Gideon. He turned around. His face was hard, not in the contained way it usually was, but in the raw way things get when the containment slips. You're asking me to sit in a room with the man who killed my father and let you ask him questions. I'm asking you to destroy him, she said. Completely. Permanently. In a way that can never be undone or appealed or walked back. She held his gaze. One swing of a fist gives you 30 seconds. What I'm describing gives you the rest of your life with this ranch clear and his name in federal criminal records and every official he ever owned answering to a grand jury. Gideon said nothing. You decide, she said. This is your land. Your father. Your call. The silence lasted long enough that she thought he might say no. That the 3 years of wait might win over the logic of it, and she wouldn't blame him. She understood wanting the 30 seconds. She understood it in her bones. Set it up, he said. Getting word to Senator Crane required a letter hand-delivered by one of Gideon's most trusted men, not Harlan, not anyone who regularly reported to Harlan to the senator's office in Austin, marked personal and urgent. Crane's response came back within 4 days, which told Nora that the senator had been waiting for exactly this kind of approach from exactly this kind of source. The federal investigator was harder. Gideon's Austin lawyer made the contact through channels that didn't involve the local federal office, because the local federal office had a man in it they weren't certain of. The investigator who agreed to come was from a field office 2 states over a woman named Agnes Pruitt, whose name Gideon's lawyer said with the particular respect people reserve for someone who has earned it the hard way. The journalist was a man named Colt Varga, who wrote for a paper in Dallas and had been covering land fraud in Texas for 7 years. When Gideon's lawyer reached him, he was already on another story that touched Meridian Land Holdings from a different angle. He agreed to come without hesitation and asked only that he be allowed to publish simultaneously with the arrest. Agreed, Nora said when Gideon relayed the terms. Comfortable with that? He asked. The faster this is public, the harder it is to suppress. Yes. They set the date for 3 weeks out, enough time to get everyone in position, not enough time for word to leak through the wrong channel. Nora continued to work the ledgers in the office every morning, and Harlan continued to come in for his daily reports, and Gideon continued to give him nothing in his face. The false information they'd fed him had done its work. The fire, the poisoned cattle, the insurance accusation, they had tracked back through the timing. Every response from Vane's side had come within 48 to 72 hours of something passing through Harlan. Channel was confirmed and still open. Through that channel, Nora crafted the message that would bring Vane to Ironwood Ridge. She wrote it carefully, in language that would sound like Gideon when Harlan transmitted it, worn down, a man whose new wife had made things more complicated rather than less, a man who was perhaps reconsidering whether the fight was worth the cost. She added one specific detail, that Nora herself had urged him towards settlement, which would confirm for Vane that the woman he'd dismissed as a desperate farmer's daughter posed no real threat. Let him think that, she figured. Let him think it right up until he sat down across from her. Vane arrived on a Tuesday in a hired coach, which told Nora things about him before he stepped out of it. A man who drove himself to an important meeting was a man who wanted control of his arrival. A man who hired a coach was a man who wanted to be seen arriving. She watched from the upstairs window as he stepped down into the yard. He was older than she'd imagined, mid-60s, well-dressed in the way of men who understand that clothes signal authority, with white hair and a face that had probably been considered handsome once and had settled into something more like commanding. He moved with the ease of a man who expected spaces to accommodate him. He looked at the house. He looked at the gates they'd closed behind his coach. He looked around the yard with the expression of a man who has been wanting to stand in this yard for a long time and is allowing himself a moment to enjoy it. She turned from the window and went downstairs. She was in the sitting room when he was shown in, not the office, which she'd decided against. The office felt like her territory now, and she didn't want him comfortable. The sitting room was neutral, formal, the kind of room that had been designed to conduct business at arm's length. Clara brought coffee without being asked, set it down, and left without making eye contact with Vane. Clara, who had worked in this house for 9 years and had watched it get bled by forces she didn't fully understand, poured the coffee with a steadiness that Nora recognized as a form of controlled fury. Vane looked at Nora when he came in. He made a quick assessment, the kind men do when they've been told to expect someone and have already decided what they'll find. She could see him concluding what he'd expected. Young, plain dressed, out of her depth. "Mrs. Rourke," he said, and the way he said it was just barely too smooth. "I had expected to meet with your husband. Gideon is occupied on the north pasture," Nora said. "He asked me to begin." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Please sit down." He sat. He accepted coffee with the ease of someone who is comfortable in rooms like this, who has sat in rooms like this many times and always left them with what he came for. "I understand there's a desire to discuss terms," he said. "I'm glad to hear it. This situation has been difficult for everyone. I want you to know that my interest has always been in preserving the value of this land, not in causing hardship to the Rourke family." Nora looked at him. "That's interesting," she said, "given that your actions have included arson, livestock poisoning, a false insurance accusation filed through a commissioner's office with documented ties to your corporate holdings, and what I believe was the deliberate orchestration of a horse accident that killed Gideon's father." The room went very still. Vane's expression didn't collapse. He was too practiced for that. But something in it recalculated, the way a card player's face changes when the hand goes differently than expected. "Those are serious allegations," he said. His voice remained smooth and quite unfounded. "Let me show you something," Nora said. She opened the folder on the table in front of her. She turned the first document toward him, the contract with the fraudulent certification date. "Contract," she said, "was certified by the county land office 3 days before it was signed. I'd like to hear your explanation for how that's possible." Vane looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. "Clerical error," he said. "These things happen in county offices. It doesn't affect the validity of." The stamp was issued from a pad that wasn't assigned to the county land office until the following month, Nora said. "We verified the stamp sequence with county records. The certification was fabricated." She turned to the next document. "This one carries a signature that doesn't match the commissioner's signature on any document from the same period. We have 11 comparison documents." She set them out, side by side, in a neat row. Vane was looking at the documents now, with an expression that had moved past smoothness into something harder underneath. "You've been busy," he said. "Yes." She turned to the payment record. "Aldridge and Carr, the firm that reviewed these contracts and told Gideon's father they were sound. Would you like to explain why a payment from your personal holding account to that firm appears in your own transaction records, dated 6 weeks before the review was conducted?" Vane set down his coffee cup. He looked at Nora directly, and for the first time something real crossed his face, not fear exactly, but the specific alertness of a man who is realizing he has walked into something and is calculating how bad it is. "You're a clever woman," he said. His voice had changed. Less smooth, more direct. "But clever doesn't win everything." "No," she agreed. "These documents, even if you're right about the certifications, even if you have some payment record that looks suspicious, this goes to a county hearing in 2 weeks. I have relationships in that office you cannot navigate around." "We're not going to the county hearing," Nora said. Stared at her. "I want to ask you about Robert Rourke," she said. "Gideon's father. He called his lawyer the week before he died. He'd found out what you'd done. You knew he'd found out." She kept her voice even and steady and very quiet. "A man who has spent 8 years riding the same horse doesn't fall on ground he knows. Not unless something frightens the horse." She paused. "What frightened the horse, Mr. Vane?" The silence that followed was different from any silence that had come before it. Vane looked at her, and in that look she saw something, not admission, but the shape of where admission lived. The way a man's face looks when he is deciding not to say a thing, because saying it would be the end of something. "I don't know what you think you can prove," he said. His voice was low now. The smoothness was gone entirely. "I've been managing this situation for years. I have documentation, I have legal standing, You have fraudulent contracts and a bribed lawyer and a pattern of organized corruption that crosses state lines," said a voice from the hallway. The doors opened. Agnes Pruitt came in first. She was a compact woman in her 40s with the economical movements of someone who had conducted a great many significant moments and didn't find it necessary to make them theatrical. Behind her came Senator Aldous Crane, who was tall and gray-haired and wearing an expression of someone who has waited 2 years to be in exactly this room. Behind him came Colt Varga with a notebook already open. And behind all of them came Gideon. He had not, it turned out, been on the north pasture. He had been in the room off the hallway, where the wall was thin, listening to every word, from the moment Silas Vane sat down. Vane stood up. He looked at the room, at Pruitt, at Crane, at Varga, at Gideon, and the calculation on his face went through its final adjustment and arrived somewhere past calculation. His face looked, for the first time, like what it was, the face of a man who has just understood that the ground he was standing on was never solid. Silas Vane, Agnes Pruitt said, and she said it in the tone of someone completing a formality. I'm a federal investigator with jurisdiction over wire fraud and organized land theft across state lines. You are going to want to come with me. Vane looked at Nora. She looked back at him. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her face still, and said nothing, because she had already said everything that needed to be said. The woman you dismissed as a desperate farmer's daughter, Gideon said from across the room, and his voice was very quiet, has been doing this to you for 6 weeks. Vane's mouth opened, closed. 2 men who had come in behind Pruitt federal officers, who had entered through the side door that Nora had unlocked herself at 5:30 that morning, moved to Vane's sides. He did not fight it. Men like Vane, she had learned, did not fight the physical moment. They had always relied on things that happened in offices and courtrooms, in documents and transactions. When those tools were gone, they had nothing left. He was handcuffed and walked out of the sitting room of Ironwood Ridge, past the door where Clara was standing with her arms folded and an expression of absolute grim satisfaction. Through the yard where ranch hands had stopped what they were doing and stood watching in silence, and into the custody of people whose authority he had not managed to compromise. Nora sat in the sitting room after he was gone. Colt Varga was talking to Crane in the hallway. Pruitt was on the porch with one of her officers. The house was full of quiet activity, the specific busyness of aftermath, of things being documented and transferred and secured. Gideon came back into the sitting room and sat down across from her, in the chair Vane had been sitting in, and looked at her. She looked back at him. You were in the other room the whole time, she said. Yes, when he almost said it about your father. I heard him. She watched his face. He was holding something. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in the careful stillness of his hands on the arms of the chair. Not the thing he'd been holding for 3 years. Something different. Something that was beginning to change shape now that the pressure that had formed it was gone. It's not enough, he said. His voice was low. Him being arrested. It's not it doesn't say the words. It doesn't admit what he did. No, she said. It doesn't. I wanted he stopped. I don't know what I wanted. Something that can't exist, she said quietly. Clean ending for something that wasn't clean. She paused. But he's finished. Everything he built to take this place is gone. The contracts are fraudulent. The officials he owned are going to be interviewed. Your father, what happened to your father, is going to be investigated by people who aren't in Vane's pocket. Gideon looked at the table, at the document still spread across it. You found all of it in 2 weeks of looking, he said. I found it because I wasn't looking for what your lawyers were looking for. She started gathering the documents into the folder. They were looking for legal arguments. I was looking for the thing that was wrong. There's a difference. Yes. She straightened the stack. Legal arguments are about interpretation. Something that's wrong is just wrong, regardless of how it's been interpreted. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. My father would have liked you, he said. Nora looked up. He was looking at the window, at the land outside, the south pasture, the grass that was still dry from the summer, but would come back in the fall the way it always did. His face had something in it she hadn't seen before. Not peace. It was too early for peace. But the early edges of it, the way a room feels when someone finally opens a window after a long time closed. I think I would have liked him, she said. Outside, past the window, Ironwood Ridge went about its afternoon. Cattle in the south pasture, horses in the paddock. Men moving between the buildings with the ordinary purpose of people who worked land that was, for the first time in years, entirely and unambiguously their own. Varga knocked on the open door. Mrs. Rourke, when you have a moment, I'd like to make sure I have the documents right. The certification dates especially. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. She looked at Gideon across the table. He looked at her. 5 minutes, she said to him. "I know," he said. And the way he said it, like he was talking about more than the journalist waiting in the hallway. Like he was talking about something that had barely started and had a very long way to go, yet settled something in her chest that she hadn't known was unsettled. She stood up and went to talk to Colt Varga. And behind her, Gideon sat in the sitting room of the house his grandfather built and his father died for, in the long gold light of a Texas afternoon, and breathed. Colt Varga's story ran in the Dallas paper 4 days after the arrest. Nora read it at the kitchen table while Clara refilled her coffee without being asked, which was the closest Clara came to expressing approval of anything. The headline was measured, but the piece itself was not Varga had done what good journalists do, which is take the thing you hand them and follow every thread attached to it until they've mapped the whole cloth. He named Vane, named Meridian Land Holdings, named the county insurance commissioner, and 2 county officials whose connection to Vane's corporate structure he'd verified independently. Quoted Senator Crane. He quoted Agnes Pruitt carefully and within what she'd authorized. He described the fraudulent certifications in language that was accurate and plain and would be understood by anyone who read it. He did not quote Nora by name. She had asked him not to, and he'd respected it, which told her something about him that she filed away. What he did write was this. The evidence that unraveled the conspiracy had been assembled over 6 weeks by a member of the Rourke household who had approached the documents not as a lawyer, but as someone who had spent her life making numbers tell the truth. Gideon read that line over her shoulder. He didn't say anything. But he refilled his own coffee and sat down across from her, and that was something. The investigations that followed Vane's arrest moved the way large institutional things move, not fast, but with a momentum that once started was difficult to stop. Agnes Pruitt's office opened formal inquiries into 4 county offices within the first 2 weeks. The county insurance commissioner resigned before he could be formally questioned, which Pruitt told Gideon's lawyer was itself useful information. Corporate structure of Meridian Land Holdings began to surface in federal records, a web of holding companies and subsidiary names that had been designed to obscure, and which now, exposed to proper scrutiny, read like a map of exactly what Vane had been doing and for how long. The false fraud accusation against Gideon collapsed within 10 days of Varga's story running. County Insurance Office issued a formal statement withdrawing the inquiry. Gideon's lawyer described the statement as the most reluctant document he had ever seen produced by a government body. Nora was in the office when the letter arrived confirming the withdrawal. She read it, set it on the desk, and went back to the secondary set of ledgers she'd been reviewing, because even with Vane arrested and the formal threats dissolving, there was still the internal problem. The falsified payroll, the padded supply invoices, the money that had been leaving Ironwood Ridge through channels that ran through Harlan Pike. She hadn't forgotten Harlan. She had just been waiting for the larger storm to clear enough to deal with him without distraction. Harlan came to find her. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected to have to go looking for him, to engineer a confrontation, to sit across from him in the office, with the ledger evidence laid out the way she'd laid out Vane's documents in the sitting room. She'd been thinking about how to do it without giving him warning, how to find him in a moment when he couldn't prepare. Instead, he knocked on the office door on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after Vane's arrest, and came in without waiting for an answer, and closed the door behind him, and looked at her with the face of a man who's been facing a man who has been carrying something until he couldn't carry it anymore. He was pale under the weathering. His hands, which she'd watched for steadiness the morning he'd come in for his report, were not steady now. "I need to talk to you," he said. Nora set down her pen. "Sit down, Harlan." He sat. He sat the way a large man sits when he's exhausted heavily, like the chair's the only thing holding him up. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor between his boots for a long moment. "I know what you found in the ledgers," he said. "I know you do." He looked up. "You've known since the second week I was here." She kept her voice even. "We knew the channel before the barn fire. The fire confirmed it. Something crossed his face pain, maybe, or the particular shame of a man who has discovered that his deception was less successful than he believed. And you didn't, We needed you to keep passing information, she said. We needed Vane to believe he was winning. Harlan sat with that. He pressed his hands together between his knees. The things he had me do, he said. The false invoices, the payroll. I want you to know that I knew what it was. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I didn't understand. Then why? He looked at her. His eyes were red at the rims. He has my son, he said. My boy Eli. He's 17. Harlan's voice broke on the number caught and steadied. 8 months ago, Vane's men took him, told me that he stopped. They told me what they'd do to him if I didn't cooperate. I've been since then. I've been doing everything they asked. Everything. His jaw worked. I didn't set the barn fire myself. But I told them the barn was isolated enough. I told them about the cattle tank schedule. I filed the payroll under the labels they gave me. He looked at his hands. I've been trying to figure out how to get my boy back without getting him killed, and I haven't been able to. He put his face in his hands. Nora looked at him. She looked at the ledgers on the desk in front of her, and the list of names in the payroll entries, and the months of small deliberate betrayals that had tracked through this man's hands. She thought about Gideon and his father and what Vane had cost this ranch and the people in it. She also thought about a 17-year-old boy who hadn't chosen any of this. Where is Eli? She said. Harlan looked up. He hadn't expected that question. There's a property. Vane had a remote holding about 60 miles northwest. In the Breaks country, his men have been keeping Eli there with 2 or 3 guards. They send word every week to confirm. His voice cracked again. Confirm he's alive. When did you last receive word? 10 days ago, before the arrest. His face went tight. I don't know what happens to Eli now that Vane's. I don't know if whoever's out there knows about the arrest. I don't know if they have orders to. He couldn't finish the sentence. Nora stood up. Stay here, she said. She went to find Gideon. She found him at the corral talking to Dex about a horse with a leg problem, and she walked up to him without preamble and said, Harlan's in the office. His son is being held at a property 60 miles northwest. Vane's men, we need to move today. Gideon looked at her. 1 beat. 2. How reliable is the information? I think he's telling the truth. His hands are shaking. He looked at Dex. Saddle 6 horses. Working tack, nothing fancy. Tell Reeves and Carter I need them in the yard in 20 minutes. He looked back at Nora. Go back and get the exact location from him. Any details he has about the guards, the layout, what Eli looks like. You should hear it yourself. He was already moving toward the office. I'm right behind you. Harlan described the place with the precision of a man who had memorized everything he'd been given access to about his son's whereabouts and turned it over in his mind every day for 8 months. A stone outbuilding on the far side of an old cattle operation that Vane had acquired years back as a shell holding. 2 to 3 men on rotation. Eli in a back room locked, but reportedly unharmed as of 10 days prior. The access road ran off the main track about 12 miles past a visible landmark, a ruined windmill, distinctive, one blade gone. Gideon listened without interrupting. When Harlan finished, Gideon was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling us this now? He said. His voice was not warm, but it wasn't what Nora might have expected from a man who'd just heard a confession of months of deliberate sabotage of his ranch. Measured, like he was trying to locate the right place to stand. Because Vane's arrested, and I don't know what his men will do, Harlan said. And because he stopped. Because I have been living with what I've done to you in your father's place, and I'm not going to keep... His voice gave out entirely. Gideon looked at him for a long moment. My father trusted you, he said. I know. You were here when he died. You held this place together while I got back. I know what I owe this family. Harlan's voice was barely audible. I know it can't be paid. Gideon looked at the wall. The window. At Nora, briefly. If Eli is where you say he is, Gideon said, we'll bring him back. And then we're going to have a full conversation about what comes next. All of it. The ledgers, the sabotage, the testimony you're going to give Pruitt's office. You understand me? Yes. But the boy comes first. Gideon straightened up. Come with us. You know the land out there better than my men do. Harlan looked at him with the expression of a man who had not expected that and didn't know what to do with it. You'd take me. You're not useful to me sitting in an office, Gideon said. And your boy is out there. He moved toward the door. Let's go. They rode hard for the first 2 hours, conserving just enough that the horses had something left when they needed it. Gideon led, Harlan rode beside him to navigate, and 4 ranch hands' decks among them rode behind. Nora had tried to come. Gideon had looked at her with an expression that was not a refusal, but was something short of agreement. You're better used here, he said. If something goes wrong out there, you're who I need holding things together back here. She had looked at him for a long moment. Nothing goes wrong, she said. No, he agreed. Nothing goes wrong. He rode out, and she watched the horses clear the gate, and then she went inside and stood in the office and looked at the ledgers on the desk and thought about a boy named Eli who was 17 and locked in a stone room 60 miles northwest. And she did what she always did when she was afraid. For people she couldn't reach, she worked. She wrote out a full accounting of the payroll fraud and supply padding for Pruitt's office. She organized the ledger evidence into a sequence that could be presented clearly by someone who hadn't assembled it. She drafted a letter to Margaret Hollis in Dry Creek with a summary of where things stood, because Margaret deserved to know and because Nora trusted her judgment. She did not check the clock more than necessary. That was the discipline of it. They were back before dark. She heard the horses in the yard and was out the door before she'd consciously made the decision to move. Gideon came through the gate first, and behind him, on a horse Dex was leading, was a thin boy with dark circles under his eyes and wrists that had the chafed look of someone who'd spent time tied, and a face that was young in the specific way faces are young when fear has stripped everything extraneous away. Harlan was off his horse before it stopped moving. He crossed the yard in 4 steps and had his arms around his son, and Eli, who was trying very hard to look like he hadn't been terrified for 8 months, lasted about 3 seconds before he stopped trying. Nora watched from the porch. She did not look away from it. It seemed important not to look away. Gideon came up the porch steps. He was dusty and tired, and there was a cut on his left hand that he'd wrapped with a piece of cloth that had seen better days. The guards, she said. 3 of them. 2 cooperated. 1 didn't. He looked at his hand, nothing serious. You should have Clara look at that. I will. He looked out at the yard, at Harlan and his son. He was in there, exactly where Harlan said. His jaw moved. Kid hasn't had a full meal in 2 weeks. They were running low on supplies and apparently didn't consider that a priority. Nora pressed her lips together. He's going to need the doctor. I already sent Reeves for him. Gideon looked at her. You did the accounting for Pruitt while we were gone. It wasn't a question. He'd seen her at the desk when he came through. It's on the desk, she said. I also wrote out the supply fraud in a form that's presentable to a grand jury. Something shifted in his expression. You don't stop, he said. No. Is that a choice or it's a habit, she said. My father used to say the work doesn't stop because you're tired. It just waits. She paused. He wasn't wrong. Gideon looked at her for a moment. He sounds like someone I'd have wanted to know. He'd have given you an argument about something within 10 minutes of meeting you, she said. He gives everyone an argument. It's how he shows interest. Gideon almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close the muscles of it without the completion. How is he? Better. Caleb wrote that he's been sitting up in the mornings. She'd gotten the letter the previous day and read it 3 times. He walked to the porch yesterday. First time in 2 months. Gideon nodded. He looked out at the yard again, at the ordinary evening activity of the ranch, beginning to resume around the extraordinary moment of a father and his son, at Dex taking the horses in, at Clara coming down the porch steps with a blanket and what looked like bread. Clara's going to feed that boy until he can't move, he said. Yes, Nora agreed. She's been looking for someone to take care of since I arrived and stubbornly refused to need it. This time the almost smile made it all the way. It changed his face. Not into something unfamiliar, but into something she realized she'd been watching for, without knowing she was watching for it. You do stubbornly refuse, he said. I was raised to, she said. He looked at her. It was a long look, unhurried, the kind he gave things he was deciding something about. Your father taught you well, he said. He did his best, she said, with what he had. So did mine, Gideon said quietly. They stood on the porch in the cooling evening air, while the yard settled into itself below them. The boy eating, the father watching him eat with the expression of a man whose debt to the world is larger than he knows how to address. The ordinary work of the ranch continuing in the background, horses and hands, and the last light on the pasture. Harlan's testimony to Pruitt's office took 3 full days. He sat in a room in town with Gideon's lawyer and Pruitt's deputy, and went through every conversation with Vane's men, every piece of information he'd passed, every instruction he'd received and carried out. He didn't minimize. He didn't omit. Nora had told him once, very directly, that the value of his testimony was directly proportional to its completeness, and he had taken that to heart in the way a man takes things to heart when he understands he has no more room for mistakes. His testimony added 3 names to the federal investigation that Pruitt's office hadn't had before, men in Vane's network who'd operated below the level of documentation, handling the physical side of the operation. The barn, the cattle tank, the men who'd approached Caleb in Dry Creek. It also provided something Nora hadn't fully anticipated, a direct account of a conversation between Vane and one of his associates, overheard by Harlan, in which Vane discussed the specific management of the situation surrounding Robert Rourke's death. The conversation was not a confession. It was oblique, cautious, the way such conversations always are between men who are careful. But it was enough. Agnes Pruitt added the matter of Robert Rourke's death to the formal federal inquiry. Gideon received the letter informing him of that addition on a Monday morning. Nora was in the office when he read it. She watched his face and didn't say anything. He set the letter down. He looked at the window. He was quiet for a long time. "It's not a verdict," he finally said. "No," she agreed. "It's not, he can't answer for it the way, no." He pressed his fingers against the desk. "It's not nothing. It's not nothing," she said. "It's official record. It's federal record. Whatever happens in the trial, his name is attached to the investigation into your father's death. That can't be undone." Gideon was quiet for another moment. "My father built this place for 40 years, he said. He fought for the water rights for 11 of them. He signed the wrong contracts because someone he trusted told him they were safe. He looked at the letter. He deserved better than what he got." "Yes," Nora said. "He did. I'm not going to get what I actually want," Gideon said. His voice was level, not bitter. The kind of level that comes from spending a long time with a hard fact and deciding to carry it rather than fight it. "I know that. I think I've known it since the beginning. But I thought if I could at least." "You've done it," she said quietly. "Contracts are void. The men responsible are facing federal charges. The record of what happened to your father is being officially investigated. And Ironwood Ridge is yours." She paused, completely and unambiguously, and in ways that cannot be legally challenged by anyone. "Your grandfather built it. Your father held it. You kept it." He looked at her. "You kept it," she said again. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before, not weighted with uncertainty or held back things, but just quiet. The ordinary quiet of a room where the worst has been said and survived. "We kept it," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with that directness that she'd learned was how he said the things he wasn't going to say more elaborately. "We kept it," she agreed. Harlan's legal situation resolved slowly, the way legal situations do. He accepted full responsibility for his role in the sabotage and the ledger fraud. He cooperated completely with Pruitt's office and with the state attorney's investigation into Vane's network. His lawyer Gideon paid for the lawyer, which Harlan argued against, and Gideon refused to debate successfully that the coercion he'd operated under was genuine and documented and relevant to his culpability. He served time, not as much as he might have without the cooperation and the coercion documentation, but real time because real things had been done. Cattle had died. A barn had burned. The Rourke ranch had been bled for months through his hands. The morning Harlan left for the facility in Huntsville, he came to the house first. He knocked on the front door, which he had never done in 12 years of working here. He'd always come around to the side, the way working men do at the houses of employers. The front door was a choice. Gideon opened it. Harlan stood on the porch with his hat in both hands. "I wanted to say it to your face," he said. "What I did to you. What I did to your father's place. I wanted to..." He stopped. "There isn't a word for it that's big enough. Gideon looked at him for a long moment. His face was doing the thing it did carefully held, not giving too much away. Then he stepped aside and held the door open. "Come in," he said. Clara made breakfast. Harlan blinked. "I'm leaving in an hour." "Then come eat in an hour and leave from here," Gideon said. "You were part of this ranch for 12 years, and you did what you did because someone took your son. I'm not going to pretend that excuses it, but I'm also not going to send you off from a front porch." Harlan came in. He sat at the kitchen table where he'd sat hundreds of times before, in the chair that had always been his chair when he ate with the hands, and Clara put a plate in front of him that was large enough to constitute a statement. Eli was there too. He was staying at Ironwood Ridge while his father was away. Gideon had arranged it without discussion, and Nora had second-guessed it for about 4 hours before deciding it was right. The boy needed somewhere stable. Ironwood Ridge was stable. And whatever else Harlan had done, Eli hadn't done it. Eli sat across from his father and ate and didn't say much. He was still thin. He'd put some back on in the weeks since the rescue, but he had a way to go yet, and he had the watchful quality of a young person who has learned that situations can change fast and has started monitoring for it. Nora recognized that quality. She'd had it herself at 16. The breakfast lasted 40 minutes. When it was done, Harlan stood up and put on his hat and shook Gideon's hand, and the handshake went on for a moment longer than handshakes usually do. He nodded to Nora on his way out. She nodded back. She watched through the window as he walked down the drive to where the county vehicle was waiting, and she thought about how much a person's life could hinge on one impossible situation and the choices they made inside it. Not the choices they'd meant to make, not the choices they'd have made with more time or more options, but the actual choices, the ones made in the dark under pressure, which are the only choices that finally count. Vane's trial began 6 months after his arrest and ran for 3 weeks. Nora attended 2 days of it, the day the fraudulent certifications were entered into evidence, and the day Harlan testified. She sat in the gallery both days and watched the proceedings with the attention of someone who had assembled much of what was being presented and wanted to see how it held up in the open. It held up completely. The fraudulent certifications, the bribed attorney, the payment records, the pattern of sabotage documented through the ledger evidence, and Harlan's testimonial of it entered the record cleanly and was argued by a federal prosecutor who was good at her job. Vane's defense attempted to characterize the certification dates as clerical error, the payment to Aldridge and Carr as routine legal consultation, the sabotage as unconnected to his client. The jury was out for 4 hours. Gideon wasn't there for the verdict. He was at Ironwood Ridge. He'd attended the first day and left, and Nora understood that being in that room, watching Vane perform innocence in front of a federal court, had costs that weren't worth paying. She'd gone back for the specific days she needed to see and left the rest to the lawyers. She was on the road back to Ironwood Ridge when the wire reached her at the relay station in Kerrville. Gideon's lawyer had sent it the moment the verdict came through. She read it once standing at the station counter. Guilty. All charges. Sentencing in 30 days. She folded the wire and put it in her coat pocket and rode the last 20 miles home. Gideon was at the corral when she arrived. She rode through the gate and he came over and took Pearl's bridle while she dismounted, which he only did when he had something to say that he didn't want to say across a distance. She handed him the wire. He read it. He stood there for a moment, holding the paper, and she watched him the way she'd learned to watch him. Not the surface of his face, but the small things. The set of his jaw, the quality of the stillness. He folded the wire. He handed it back to her. All charges, she said. Yes. Including the inquiry into your father. He looked at her. That's separate from the conviction. The investigation is ongoing. I know. But it's official. It's federal record. It goes into every document that references him for the rest of his life. She paused. He will never be referred to without the record of what he did. Gideon looked at the corral, at the horses moving in the evening light, at the land that went in every direction from where they were standing, 40,000 acres of it, his grandfather's work and his father's work and his own work, and now, in ways that were still becoming clear to her, some amount of her own. My father would want me to move forward, he said. He wasn't a man who he didn't hold things. He dealt with them and moved. A pause. I've been trying to be more like that. You were like that, Nora said. More than you think. He looked at her with that directness. You've known me for 7 months. Long enough, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The evening was cooling down from the day's heat, and somewhere in the south pasture cattle were moving, and the windmill near the water tank was turning in the easy way it turns, when there's just enough wind to move it without strain. I owe you an honest thing, he said. She waited. I told you, at the beginning, that I'd been told you were steady, that people talked. He paused. That wasn't entirely complete. She looked at him. I'd seen you before, he said. In town. More than once. Over more than a year. He wasn't looking at her now. He was looking at the corral, or at something past it. You were at the feed store once with your brother. He was giving you an argument about something, and you were listening to him, like what he was saying actually mattered. Like a 16-year-old boy's opinion was worth your full attention. He paused. And once I saw you stop on the road near your property line to help a neighbor get a cartwheel seated back in a rut. It was a bad day. I could see that, the way you were moving, the set of you, but you stopped anyway. Nora said nothing. I needed a legal wife, he said. That was true. But I chose you because I'd been watching someone do the right thing by the people around them for over a year and wondering what kind of person that was. He looked at her now. I wanted to find out. The evening sat around them. Pearl huffed softly in the paddock. Somewhere behind them, in the kitchen, Clara was making something that smelled like it had onions in it. You could have just introduced yourself, Nora said. Something crossed his face briefly, like the idea was genuinely funny to him. I could have, he said, but you didn't. I'm better at solving problems than starting conversations. I've noticed, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Are you? He stopped, seemed to recalibrate. I know what the arrangement was. 6 months, and you could leave with everything secured. That time hasn't been past that. I know, she said. You've stayed. I know that too. He looked at her. Waiting, she realized. This man who acted on things before he said them, who had ridden 60 miles to rescue a boy he had every reason to leave to his fate, who had held his grief about his father for 3 years with a discipline that would have broken most people. This man was waiting for her. I'm not leaving, she said. He breathed out. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. All right, he said. All right, she said. They stood at the corral in the evening with the land going on around them in every direction, and it was not a perfectly resolved thing. There were still threads of the federal investigation to track. Still the matter of rebuilding trust among some of the ranch hands who'd watched Harlan leave in a county vehicle. Still the long, quiet work of 2 people who had come together, sideways figuring out what they actually were to each other. None of that was finished. Most of it was barely started. But Ironwood Ridge was theirs, cleanly and completely, and in ways that no fraudulent document and no corrupt official and no land commissioner with 12 years of practiced deception could reach. The first thing Nora did the next morning was write to her father. The second thing she did was pull out the ledgers, not the old ones, the fraud evidence she'd spent weeks analyzing, but the working ledgers, the current accounts. Because the ranch was losing money through false channels for over a year, and it was time to rebuild what had been taken, and she knew exactly where to start. She opened the book. She picked up her pen, and she began. Vane's sentencing came on a cold morning in November, and Nora didn't go. She'd thought about it. She'd thought about sitting in that gallery one more time and watching the federal judge read the terms out loud. The years, the fines, the formal dissolution of Meridian Land Holdings as a legal entity under Texas and federal law. She'd thought about what it would feel like to watch the thing they had built together. She and Gideon and Margaret Hollis and Agnes Pruitt and a journalist with an open notebook arrive at its final official form. In the end, she stayed at Ironwood Ridge and worked the morning accounts, because that was what the ranch needed that day. And because she had learned something over the past months about the difference between needing to witness a thing and needing the thing to be done. She needed it done. She didn't need to watch. Gideon's lawyer sent the wire by noon. 18 years, federal facility, no possibility of early release on the primary fraud charges. The investigation into Robert Rourke's death had produced enough to add a charge of criminal conspiracy resulting in wrongful death. It was not murder in the first degree. The evidence, oblique and overheard and circumstantial, hadn't reached that threshold. But it was federal record. It was official. Silas Vane would die with Robert Rourke's name attached to his. Gideon read the wire at the kitchen table. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and went out to the south pasture, and Nora let him go alone because she understood by now that he processed the things that mattered most by moving through the land that had been the reason for all of it. She watched from the window as he walked out past the corral and into the grass, just a man getting smaller against the size of what he'd inherited and fought for and kept. And she thought that was probably the right way to receive the end of something that had cost this much. He came back an hour later. He came into the kitchen, and Clara poured coffee without being asked, and he sat down across from Nora and said, "It's done." "Yes," she said. "Not the way I wanted it to be done." "No." He looked at his coffee. "But done," she said. He looked up. Something had settled in him, not peace exactly, not the clean resolution of a thing fully closed, but the particular steadiness of a man who has put down a weight he's been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing its shape. He still had the marks of it. He would always have the marks of it. But he was standing without it now, and that was different. "My father's name is in the federal record," he said. "Yes, as the victim. Not as a man who signed bad contracts. As the man Vane killed," Nora said quietly, "to get what he wanted." Gideon nodded once. He drank his coffee. Clara, who never hovered, found a reason to wipe down the counter nearest them and stayed in the kitchen longer than necessary, which was the closest she had ever come to, acknowledging that something significant was happening in her presence. The first program Nora established used ranch funds, and she presented the idea to Gideon the same way she presented everything, with a written proposal, specific numbers, projected outcomes. She'd learned quickly that Gideon respected this, not because he needed the formality, but because it signaled that she'd thought the thing through rather than just felt strongly about it. She sat across from him in the office on a January evening and laid out 3 pages in her handwriting. Legal assistance for ranch families facing fraudulent contract challenges. A small but funded office in Dry Creek, staffed by a rotating attorney available to families in 3 counties who couldn't afford representation. He read through it. He turned the pages without comment. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her. "You've been working on this since October," he said. "Since August," she said. "I drafted the first version the week after Vane was arrested. Why didn't you show me sooner?" "Because we had a federal investigation, a trial, a sentencing, and the East Pasture fencing project, and I didn't think the timing was right." She paused. "Timing is right now." He looked at the proposal again. "The funding model here, you're drawing from the ranch operating accounts. A sustainable percentage. I've run the numbers 4 ways. It doesn't touch the capital reserves, and it doesn't affect payroll or operations." She pointed to the 3rd page. "This projection shows that in 3 years, the program is partially self-sustaining through small case fees from families who can pay something and grants from the State Legal Foundation." He was quiet for a moment. "You want Margaret Hollis to advise on the structure." She agreed already. "I wrote to her in December." Nora kept her face neutral. "I wanted to know if the concept was sound before I brought it to you." Gideon looked at her. Something crossed his face that was not quite exasperation and not quite admiration, which was a combination she had come to recognize as specific to her. "You wrote to Margaret before you told me," he said. "I told you I wanted to know if it was sound. And if it hadn't been sound? Then I would have revised it until it was and then told you." She met his eyes. "I wasn't going to bring you a half-formed idea." He was quiet for another moment. Then he picked up the pen from the desk and signed the bottom of the 3rd page, where she'd left a line for his authorization. "The scholarships," he said, setting the pen down. "The ones for rural children. That's a second proposal?" "That's next month," she said. He almost smiled. "Of course it is." The scholarship fund came out of a separate allocation and was structured with the help of a banker in Austin who was not Chester Pratt Chester. Pratt had quietly resigned from First Cattle Bank of Dry Creek 6 weeks after Vane's arrest. When it became apparent that his treatment of the Whitlock debt and his long-standing relationship with certain Meridian land holdings accounts were going to receive the kind of attention he'd rather avoid. The new banker was a woman named Dorothea Kemp, who had opinions about rural education funding and brought two ideas to Nora's initial conversation that Nora hadn't thought of yet, which was exactly the kind of collaboration that Nora found useful. The scholarships funded schooling for children from farming and ranching families in 4 counties. Not just through basic school completion, but through whatever further education the recipient chose. The application required nothing more than demonstrated need and a letter from a teacher or community member attesting to the student's effort. Not brilliance, not exceptional talent. Effort, which was the thing Nora had decided mattered most, because it was the thing that poverty tried hardest to extinguish, and the thing that persisted longest when someone bothered to support it. She knew something about that from the inside. Caleb was one of the first recipients, which she had not engineered. She'd explicitly recused herself from the selection process for the first year and handed it to a committee of 3 people who didn't know her brother personally. The committee selected him on the merits of his application, which his teacher had apparently written with enough force that one committee member described it later as the most persuasive letter of recommendation she'd ever read. He came to Ironwood Ridge the summer after his selection to tell her in person, because Caleb had decided somewhere in the months of letters back and forth that Ironwood Ridge was a place he was allowed to come, which he expressed by arriving without much advance notice on a Tuesday morning and tying his horse at the gate and walking up the drive like he'd been doing it for years. Nora saw him from the porch and came down the steps. He was taller than she remembered. Boys do that. They change in the intervals between seeings, and you catch up to the new version of them in a moment of adjustment. He still had their father's jaw and their mother's eyes, and his own particular way of looking at things sideways before he looked at them directly. "You didn't fix the scholarship so I'd get it," he said, before she could say anything. "Didn't," she said. I asked around. "You weren't on the committee." I was not. He looked at her for a moment. He was trying to decide whether to believe her, which was fair, and then he did, which was also fair because she was telling the truth. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. "Are you going to come inside, or are we doing this in the drive?" He came inside. He ate enough at lunch that Clara looked satisfied in a way she rarely looked satisfied, because Caleb ate the way young men eat when they've been doing physical work all morning and aren't embarrassed about being hungry. He talked to Gideon about the East Pasture fencing project with the unself-conscious directness of someone who had grown up around practical work and understood it. And Gideon talked back in the same register, which Nora watched from across the table and thought something that didn't have clean words for it yet. After lunch, Caleb found her in the office, where she'd gone to let them keep talking without her presence changing the shape of it. "He's all right," Caleb said from the doorway. "Yes," Nora said. "Better than all right." He leaned against the doorframe. "Papa likes him too." He said so. Nora looked up. "Papa said so." "In the way Papa says things. You know how he says things." Did know. Their father said things the way water moves indirectly, by finding the low places, arriving at the destination without announcing the route. If he'd said something about Gideon that Caleb was reporting this carefully, it meant something had been said that actually mattered. He said. Caleb stopped, looked at the floor briefly, the same gesture he'd had since he was small. He said a man who pays attention to the people around him before he asks anything of them is a man worth knowing. A pause. He said you always did have good instincts about people, even when you didn't trust them yourself. Nora looked at her brother. He looked back at her with the expression of someone delivering a message and wanting to get it right. "I think he meant it as a compliment," he said. "To you." "Not Rourke, I know," she said. And to Rourke, he added. "I know that too." Her father came to Ironwood Ridge in the spring, his first long journey since he'd gotten sick, and he made it in a wagon Gideon had sent to Dry Creek with instructions that could be summarized as make the ride comfortable enough that he doesn't have an argument to make about not coming. Her father had made the argument anyway, because he always did, and then he'd come because, underneath the argument, he'd wanted to see it. He arrived in the late afternoon, when the light was good on the south pasture, and the cattle were visible in numbers that were difficult to argue with. Nora came out to meet the wagon and helped him down, and he stood in the yard and looked at the house, the stone, the scale of it. the evidence of what it had taken to build and hold, and was quiet in the way he was quiet when something was larger than what he'd prepared for. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said. "You didn't tell me it was like this." "I told you it was a large cattle operation." "You said ranch," he said. "People say ranch. They don't usually mean—" He made a gesture at the entirety of it. "I didn't want to—" She paused. "I didn't want it to change how you thought about me being here." He looked at her. He had the same sideways first quality that Caleb had, which meant she'd grown up with it and could read it well. He was seeing something he was deciding how to say. "It doesn't change anything about you," he said. "You know that." "I know. You are still the girl who fixed my accounts at 15 and argued with me about every entry I'd gotten wrong and was right about most of them." He put his hand on her arm. Briefly, her father wasn't a demonstrative man, but he had his moments. "This," he gestured again, "is the result of who you are. Not the other way." Nora looked at the house. She thought about the first night she'd stood in this yard. The orange light from the windows, the cattle sounds in the dark, the particular vertigo of realizing the world was larger than what you'd prepared for. "Come inside," she said. "Clara made enough for 8 people, and there are only 5 of us for dinner." He came inside. He sat at the kitchen table and talked to Gideon for 2 hours. And she had been right. He gave Gideon an argument within 10 minutes about cattle rotation and its effect on soil quality. And Gideon argued back with specific knowledge and no deference. And her father's eyes lit up the way they did when he met someone who didn't back down just to be agreeable. After dinner, her father sat on the porch in the cooling air, and Nora sat beside him. And they were quiet together the way they'd been quiet together through her whole childhood, the specific comfortable quiet of 2 people who have nothing left to prove to each other. "You're happy here," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," she said. "It surprised me. Things that matter usually do." He was looking at the dark outline of the pasture. "Your mother used to say," he stopped, started again. "She used to say that the life you plan and the life you get are almost never the same thing, and the only question is whether you're brave enough to love the one you actually have." Nora looked at her father's profile in the dark. He didn't talk about her mother often. When he did, it was always like this sideways, arrived at by accident or by some internal decision she couldn't see being made. "She was right," Nora said. "She usually was," he said. Annoying trait, but the way he said it had warmth in it that went all the way down. The railroad company arrived 3 years after Vane's sentencing. Came with lawyers and a survey crew, and the particular confidence of a corporate entity that has used legal pressure to move stubborn landowners before and expects to use it again. The proposed line would run through the southeastern corner of Ironwood Ridge. Not a devastating cut, but a real one, through land that included 2 of the creek feeding channels that made the water rights valuable. Nora read the initial notice at the kitchen table with the same attention she'd given Vane's contracts 5 years earlier. The legal mechanism was different eminent domain arguments, this time, dressed in language about public benefit and regional development, but the underlying logic was familiar. A large entity assuming that a piece of land could be taken because the taking was convenient, and the opposition was expected to be manageable. She set the notice down. "Same fight?" Gideon asked from across the table. "Different tools," she said. "Eminent domain requires demonstrating public benefit. The legal threshold is specific, and we can challenge it." She was already thinking through who she needed to call. "But we're not doing this alone." They weren't. That was the thing that was different now, and the thing that Nora understood had been built not by accident, but by the slow accumulation of every decision she'd made since the legal assistance program opened, since the scholarships went out, since the first family they'd helped had kept their ranch, and the second family had kept theirs, and word had spread through 3 counties. The way word spreads through communities that have learned to pay attention to who shows up for them. She sent letters to 14 families who had used the legal assistance program. She contacted the attorney Nora had personally mentored through the scholarship fund, a young woman named Rosa Delgado, who had come from a dry dirt farm in the next county and was now practicing law in Austin, with the specific ferocity of someone who understood exactly what was at stake in land fights, because she'd watched her own family almost lose one. Rosa Delgado took the railroad case without hesitation and without asking about her fee in the first conversation, which told Nora everything she needed to know about what the work had meant to her. The challenge took 14 months. It was not clean or linear. There were procedural setbacks, an emotion that nearly went the wrong way, and a month when the survey crew came back and started marking stakes in the ground before a temporary injunction stopped them. Nora drove stakes of her own that month, not into the ground, but into the record, working with Rosa and the Legal Assistance Office to document every water dependency the proposed line would affect. Every family downstream whose irrigation relied on the creek channels, every environmental and agricultural impact that the railroad's impact assessment had conveniently minimized. The 14 families who had come when she called showed up in force for the public comment period. They brought their own documentation. They brought their neighbors. They brought a level of organized, specific, evidence-based opposition that the railroad's lawyers had not anticipated from rural landowners in this county. And Rosa Delgado stood before the state land board and dismantled the public benefit argument piece by piece with the precision of someone who had learned, from the ground up, exactly how these things were built and therefore exactly where they were weak. The railroad withdrew its eminent domain claim 4 months after the hearing. Nora got the news by telephone. Ironwood Ridge had a telephone line now, which Gideon had resisted until the 4th time a wire delay had cost them something real, at which point he'd had the line run without further discussion. Rosa called from Austin, and Nora heard the particular sound in her voice of someone very young and very capable, arriving at a moment they've been working toward without entirely believing they'd reach it. "We won," Rosa said, simply, like she was still deciding if it was real. "You won," Nora said. "I read the briefs. You won this." "I learned how to build a case like that from watching you," Rosa said. "From reading your ledger work. From understanding that the detail is where the truth lives." Nora stood in the hallway with the telephone receiver in her hand and thought about a 23-year-old woman in a bank in Dry Creek with $46 and a pen she hadn't yet put down. She thought about the number that used to float above her in the dark, patient, and enormous, the shape of what she owed. She thought about the moment a man she didn't know walked through a door and changed the direction of everything. "The detail is where the truth lives," she said. "My father taught me that." "Then tell him I said thank you," Rosa said. Nora almost laughed. "I will." Her father didn't make it to see the railroad case resolved. He passed in the late fall of the 2nd year of the challenge, quietly, in the same room where he'd been sick when Nora had gone to that bank. Caleb was with him. Caleb had come back from his medical training in San Antonio 6 months earlier, set up a small practice in Dry Creek that charged what people could pay, and sometimes nothing, and spent his evenings with their father in the way of a son who understood that the evenings were becoming finite. Nora and Gideon drove to Dry Creek when Caleb sent word. She sat with her father in that last day, in the room she'd grown up knowing, and held his hand, which had grown lighter and the lines in it deeper. And he was mostly sleeping, but in one clear interval he opened his eyes and looked at her with full recognition. "You turned out well," he said. His voice was very quiet. It was such a plain thing to say, such an imperfect, ordinary, completely true thing. "I had a good teacher," she said. He squeezed her hand once. The same pressure he'd used that day in his bed when she'd told him she was married, that first day, less than a year into her life, becoming something she hadn't planned. He'd squeezed back with more strength than she expected then, and she had taken it as a question and an answer at the same time. He slept again, and didn't wake in the way of waking, and the room was quiet, and outside the window the town of Dry Creek went about its afternoon. They buried him beside her mother on the family land, the land that still carried the Whitlock name in the deed, cured there by Margaret Hollis's pen on the day of a marriage that had been a transaction and had become the central fact of Nora's life. Gideon stood beside her at the graveside and didn't try to say anything useful, which was the right choice. He'd learned that about grief from his own, that the words people offer are almost always for themselves. And what the grieving person usually needs is just the presence of someone willing to stand there without flinching. He stood there without flinching. She found that she was grateful for him in the specific and unromantic way you are grateful for someone who has made themselves genuinely necessary. Not because he was perfect. He wasn't. He was still bad at saying things before he'd already acted on them. He still stood at windows too much. He still had stretches of silence that lasted longer than comfortable, and a jaw that set against bad news in a way that took him time to unlock, and a stubbornness about certain ranch decisions that she had learned to come at from 3 directions before she found the one he could hear. And she knew, was not easy either. She pushed too hard and too fast, and sometimes forgot that other people needed more time with information than she did. She had a habit of deciding she was right before she'd finished listening. She'd been known, more than once, to present Gideon with a completed plan where a conversation might have been the better starting point. They had argued about real things. Not often, but when they did, it had weight, because they were both people who said what they meant and meant what they said, and sometimes what they meant was in direct conflict. None of that was what she'd expected marriage to feel like, reading about it as a girl. It wasn't what the story said. It was harder and more specific and more tiring, and also, in ways that the stories never quite got at, more sustaining. Because a person who sees you clearly and stays anyway is a different thing from a person who loves an idea of you. Gideon saw her clearly. He had, in some ways, seen her before she'd fully seen herself. Still thought about that, sometimes. What it meant to be witnessed before you understood what was being witnessed. June was born the spring after Nora's father died. They named her after the month, not because it was romantic, but because Gideon said a name should be something true and uncomplicated, and June was born in June, and that was true and uncomplicated. Nora had laughed when he said it, an actual laugh, which surprised them both a little. June came into the world at Ironwood Ridge, in the room with the curtains and the view of the south pasture, the room Nora had walked into on her first night here, and sat on the edge of the bed, and held her own hands, and told herself to be steady. Clara delivered her with the help of the doctor Caleb had sent up from Dry Creek, and it was not easy and it was not quick, and at the end of it, Nora was exhausted in a way that went down to the center of her bones. Gideon came in when it was done and stood beside the bed and looked at his daughter, and his face did something Nora had not seen it do before. It simply opened. No careful management, no calibrated stillness. Just a man looking at a thing that was new in the world and feeling it without armor. "She's small," he said. His voice was rough. "She's fine," Nora said. She was too tired to say more than that. "She looks like you," he said. "She's 2 hours old. She looks like a person who has had a very difficult morning." He almost laughed. He was still looking at June with that open face. "She's ours," he said, like he was saying something he needed to hear himself say. "Yes," Nora said. "She's ours. Years pass the way years do when you're inside them. Not in a sweep, but in the accumulation of days that each seem ordinary until you look back and see what they built." June grew up running the ranch the way children do, when the land is their whole world. She knew where the creek ran shallowest, and which of the horses would tolerate a small rider, and which foreman to avoid when the cattle numbers were off. She had Nora's stubbornness and Gideon's attention, and some third quality that was entirely her own, a particular fearlessness in speaking that made adults both delighted and occasionally exhausted. Caleb came to Ironwood Ridge 3 or 4 times a year, more when something was happening. His practice in Dry Creek grew. He'd trained 2 more young doctors from the scholarship program, and between them they covered the county in a way that hadn't been possible before. He charged what families could pay, which was sometimes nothing, and sometimes produce, and sometimes, once memorably, a horse that turned out to be worth considerably more than the bill. Rosa Delgado argued 2 more land cases in the region before she was appointed to a state commission on rural property rights, which was an appointment that Senator Crane had supported, and which meant that the work was no longer dependent on any single person's willingness to do it. It had become structural. It had become the kind of thing that exists in law and in process, and doesn't disappear when the person who started it moves on. Nora had wanted that from the beginning, not to be necessary forever, to build something that worked without her. She was sitting on the porch with Gideon on a September evening. June was 12 now, somewhere inside arguing with Clara about something that had the rhythm of an argument both of them were enjoying when she thought about Dry Creek. Not the bank, not Chester Pratt with his tobacco breath and his flat demand that she sign. She thought about the street outside the bank, the boardwalk, where she'd stood with a man she didn't know and tried to decide what she was walking into. She thought about what she'd been afraid of. Not of Gideon. Not exactly. She'd been afraid of what it meant to accept help. She'd been afraid that needing rescue meant she was the kind of person who got rescued, and that being that kind of person was the end of something she'd been trying to be. She'd spent years being the one who kept things together, and the terror at the center of that bank, under the outrage and the desperation, was that she'd failed. That the numbers had finally won. What she hadn't understood then, what she understood now, in the specific way you understand things you've had to live in order to know, was that accepting a hand doesn't mean you're not holding your own weight. It means the situation was bigger than one person, which is sometimes just the truth of situations. The courage isn't in refusing help. The courage is in taking the hand and then doing something with it. Making it mean something beyond survival. She'd married a stranger to save her family. She'd stayed because the work needed doing. She'd built the thing she'd built because it was necessary, and she was the person standing at the point where necessity and capacity met. None of it had gone the way she'd thought it would go. All of it had become something she wouldn't trade. "What are you thinking about?" Gideon said. He was watching the pasture the way he always watched it, not looking for anything, just keeping it in his eyes. "The bank," she said. He looked at her. "The day you walked in," she said. "I've been thinking about what I was afraid of." "What were you afraid of?" She thought about how to say it, that I was already finished. That the situation had already decided who I was going to be. She paused. "I thought poverty had already written the rest of my life." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "And now?" "Now I know that was wrong." She looked out at the south pasture, the cattle moving in the evening, the land that had been fought for with documents and ledgers, and a kind of stubbornness that turned out to be, under the right conditions, a form of power. Circumstances are loud. They tell you what's possible and what isn't, and when you're inside them, they seem permanent. They seem like facts. She paused. But they're not facts. They're conditions. Conditions change. Sometimes with help, Gideon said. Sometimes with help, she agreed. There's no shame in that. He looked at her. In the evening light, his face was older than it had been on that boardwalk, marked by the years in the ways faces get marked by years. And still that particular quality of direct attention that had unsettled her, and then steadied her, and then become one of the things she counted on. "I noticed you before I walked into that bank," he said. "I've told you that. You have. I want you to know why it mattered." He was picking his words with the care he always used for things he meant. "It wasn't that you were doing something extraordinary. It was that you were doing ordinary things, being decent, paying attention, stopping when stopping cost you something, without anyone watching. Without any reason to do it except that it was the right thing." He paused. "That's who you were before any of this. The ranch, the programs, the cases. That was already who you were." Nora looked at him for a long moment. "You saw that," she said. "Yes. Before I did. Yes." He said it without apology, which was the only way it could be true. "You were looking at the numbers. I was looking at you." Inside the house, June's voice rose in the particular register of a 12-year-old who has made a winning argument and wants it acknowledged. Clara's response had the flat tone of someone who acknowledges nothing but is secretly pleased. Gideon's mouth moved toward the thing that was almost a smile and had, over the years, actually become one. Not the guarded beginning of it she'd first seen, but the real version. Nora looked at the south pasture, at the grass that came back every year, because the water rights were solid and the land was properly kept. At the fence lines that meant 100 years of somebody's work, and at the sky above them, going orange and then red, and then the dark blue that comes just before the first stars. She thought about the frightened young woman who had walked on the bank in Dry Creek with $46, and a sick father and a brother who was trying very hard to look like things were fine. She thought about what that woman had believed was true, about what was possible, about who got to have a different kind of life, about whether the cards you were dealt at the start were the cards you played forever. She had been wrong about most of it. The most important lesson she'd learned in the years since wasn't anything she could have put in a ledger. It was this, that the circumstances that box you in are real, and the fear is real, and the weight of it is real, but they are not the final word on you. The final word is what you do with the one chance you didn't see coming. The one door that opens when everything else is closing. Not because it was easy, not because you deserved it more than someone else, but because you didn't put down the pen out of habit, because you looked at the man instead of the money, because when someone showed you a hand, you took it, and then you worked every day to make sure it meant something. She married a stranger to save her family. She stayed because she found something worth staying for. And the ranch that every greedy and corrupt man in 3 counties had spent years trying to take away had become, in the end, not just a piece of land held by legal title, but a living record of what 2 people had built when they decided, separately and then together, that the thing in front of them was worth the cost of it. Gideon reached over and put his hand on hers, where it rested on the arm of the porch chair. He didn't say anything. He just left it there. June came bursting through the front door with the specific energy of a child who has just won an argument and needs the outside world to know it. "Mama," she said, "Clara says the kitchen is closed, but I am actually still hungry, and I think that's—" "Go ask your father," Nora said. June turned to Gideon with the expression of someone recalculating odds. Gideon looked at her with the level gaze he used on situations that were trying to move him. "Kitchen's closed," he said. June's face arranged itself into tragedy. "There's bread on the second shelf," he said. "Don't tell Clara." June's tragedy evaporated. She disappeared back inside with the speed of a child who knows to take a win before it gets reconsidered. Gideon looked at Nora. Nora looked at Gideon. On Ironwood Ridge, the last light held as long as it could against the coming dark, and then let go, and the stars came out over 40,000 acres of land that was, finally and completely and without condition, home.